Hey there, you're about to watch this compilation of hand-drawn and animated history videos we made. If you want to watch our newest videos right when they come out, be sure to subscribe to our main channel, Serious History. Alright, let me get the lights for you. Today, we're going over stories of people who went to extreme lengths to take justice into their own hands. John Brown. It's 1812 and a 12-year-old boy named John Brown is delivering a herd of cattle that he'd just driven over 100 miles to the home of a U.S. Marshal. The Marshal is impressed that such a young boy was able to do this all alone and invites him to stay with him for a few days before making the trek back to Ohio. John is tired from the journey and the Marshal seems friendly, so he agrees, and together they enter his home. Inside, John sees a boy around his age dressed in ragged clothing. He excitedly rushes over to introduce himself, and the boy, though nervous at first, eventually warms up and the two begin to play together. This boy was smart, kind, and gives John some things that he'd made as gifts. Soon it's dinner time, and the Marshal calls for John to join him and the guests he invited at the table. John's new friend serves them while the Marshal praises John in front of his friends. "This boy drove all that cattle out there over 100 miles all by himself." He beams as if John were his own son. The dinner is wonderful, filled with laughter, and eventually the guests leave to head home. John is smiling, full and content. But as the Marshal closes the door behind the last of his guests, a dark scowl emerges on his face. He turns to John's friend, the boy, and he begins berating him for the mistakes he had made during dinner service. The boy is terrified as the Marshal walks to the fireplace and grabs an iron shovel. Without hesitation, the Marshal turns and begins viciously beating the boy with it. John watches helplessly as his friend is hit over and over again. The sound of the shovel ringing out against his skull echoes in the room, and he can smell the boy's blood as it begins to pour from a wound on his head. In that moment, the cruelty of the world his parents had warned him about becomes crystal clear. The Browns were Calvinists, and they had told John that slavery was an abomination against God. Though he'd heard those words countless times, this night was the first time he had seen its horrors with his own two eyes. At that moment, John Brown silently decides there is no greater evil in the world than slavery, and that he'll wage an eternal war to end it. The 1800s in America were a very uneasy period to say the least. Tensions between the northern free states and southern slave states were rapidly escalating, and his father, an abolitionist, had begun helping escaped southern slaves by sheltering them as they made their way through the Underground Railroad. Because of this upbringing, John had learned to treat every person of color with dignity and respect, and so everywhere he went, he was quick to befriend freed slaves and Native Americans. At the age of 16, he set out to make it on his own as a man. He moved from city to city, trying his hand at various businesses, all of which seemed to fail eventually. He popped out 20 kids between 2 wives, and perhaps most importantly to him, he did whatever he could to help slaves escape to a better life in the North. In 1829, Brown was operating a secret safe house for the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. One day, some neighboring white families came over and asked for his help in driving out some Native Americans from their lands. Disgusted by the request, he answered back, "I would sooner take up my gun and help drive you out of the country." But as much as John Brown hated racism, half of the country felt exactly the opposite way. Slaves were essential to the economy in the South, and with the 3/5 Compromise of 1787, which classified slaves as 3/5 of a person, Southern states quickly gained disproportionate political power in Congress. This led to the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which required Northerners to capture and return escaped slaves to their owners. Upon hearing the news, John Brown could not believe a law so heinous was passed, and for the first time in his life, he questioned if the pacifist views held by his fellow abolitionists would be enough to bring the changes required to right the wrongs being done in this country. In response, he forms a group called the League of Gileadites, an armed group who defended escaped slaves from slave catchers. They are successful, but as hard as he tries, Brown can see that the future of the country is growing increasingly grim. In 1854, Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which left the decision on whether those territories join the Union as a free state or a slave state up to a popular vote. Immediately, pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas to try to sway the voting in their favor, and amongst the anti-slavery settlers were 5 of John Brown's sons. More pro-slavery settlers pour in from Missouri and begin terrorizing anti-slavery settlements, and Brown's sons write to him asking him to come to Kansas to help the cause. Initially, he refuses, but by October of 1855, John cannot turn a blind eye to the possibility of another slave state joining the Union, and so he loads up a wagon of rifles, pistols, and swords and heads west to help his sons. Kansas was primed as a political powder keg ready to explode, and though he did not know it at the time, John Brown would be the one to light the match. On May 21st of 1856, a pro-slavery group sacked the anti-slavery city of Lawrence, Kansas, and the following day, pro-slavery Representative Preston Brooks savagely beat Senator Charles Sumner with a cane on the Senate floor after he'd given an anti-slavery speech. The 1-2 combo of the sacking of Lawrence and the caning of Sumner breaks something inside of the 55-year-old John Brown. His whole life, he had hoped the South would eventually see that slavery was morally wrong. But now he realizes this was nothing but a fool's dream. The so-called abolitionists in the North were all cowards. They do nothing but talk. Slavery must end by any means necessary. If no one else will do it, then he will deliver God's judgment himself. And so, on the night of May 24th, 1856, John brings a group made up of his sons and fellow abolitionists to the home of pro-slavery settler James P. Doyle and demands that he and his sons come out. Doyle and 2 of his adult children nervously comply, and they are led 100 yards into the darkness. The group of men walk silently in the light of the moon until Brown's 2 sons turn towards the Doyles and draw broadswords. Cold and emotionless, they raise their weapons and begin hacking their hostages to pieces. Screams fill the night air as John Brown draws his pistol and fires a round point blank into James Doyle's forehead, finishing him off. The Brown party traveled to 2 more houses that night and executed 2 more pro-slavery settlers. John Brown was now a murderer, and this event, known as the Pottawatomie Massacre, kicked off a state-level civil war that would be called Bleeding Kansas. John Brown quickly becomes public enemy number 1 amongst the pro-slavery settlers in the territory, and warrants are put out for his capture, dead or alive. But Brown does not back down, and he leads his anti-slavery militia in multiple battles across Kansas against pro-slavery forces, becoming a highly polarizing national figure. By the end of the year, the anti-slavery settlers in Kansas seemed to have turned the tide, and it was looking like Kansas would eventually join the Union as a free state. Leading Kansas had not been easy for John as he lost one of his sons in the violence, and with the increasing bounties being put on his head, he decides to leave the area as a wanted man. By his exit from Kansas, his deeds had turned him into a household name. Many in the North called him a hero fighting for justice, while in the South, he was branded as a deranged lunatic. But what John Brown planned to do next would make all the previous events appear small in comparison, and it would change the course of American history forever. In August of 1859, John meets his longtime friend, escaped slave and activist Frederick Douglass, in an abandoned stone quarry in Pennsylvania. Now a wanted man, the meeting is done in secrecy with just a few in attendance. After exchanging pleasantries, Brown tells his old friend about a plan he'd been working on for years. Inspired by the story of Moses, who led the slaves out of Egypt in the Bible, and the tales of Spartacus, a slave who had led a slave rebellion against the mighty Roman Empire, Brown believed deep in his heart that the slaves in the United States, if provided the opportunity and proper means, would rise up against their oppressors and take their freedom for themselves. Douglass cannot believe what he's hearing, as Brown continues to share his plan to raid the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and incite an insurrection of slaves against their owners. Douglass desperately pleads with his friend not to do this. Attacking a federal building would be a suicide mission. But Brown pushes back, saying that he's now realized his purpose. He is an instrument of God, and this act would serve as notice to all slaves in America that their friends had come. As they part ways, Brown turns to his friend and tries one last time. "Come with me, Douglass. I will defend you with my life." Douglass shakes his head, but an escaped slave who had accompanied him to the meeting is moved by Brown's words and agrees to join him on his mission. Frederick Douglass smiles weakly at his dear friends, shakes their hands, and says goodbye. And so, in the dark of the night on October 16, 1859, John Brown and 18 of the 22 men he had brought with him sneak into Harper's Ferry and cut the telegraph lines into the town. They quickly seize the federal arsenal and take the commanding officer, Lewis Washington, George Washington's great-grandnephew, hostage. Everything is going exactly to plan. The arsenal contained over 100,000 rifles and muskets, more than enough to fuel any slave uprising. Now all they had to do was wait for them to come and join them. But instead of reaching the slaves he had hoped for, word of Brown's capture of the arsenal spreads much more quickly to militias in nearby towns, who all race to Harper's Ferry. By the following day, Brown's raiders find themselves surrounded. He had waited too long for an army of slaves that never showed up, and now he was trapped. Firefights break out, and Brown's raiders flee into the nearby fire engine house with their hostages. By nightfall, President Buchanan orders a detachment of U.S. Marines to Harper's Ferry and commands Army Colonel Robert E. Lee to lead them to retake the armory. On October 17th, after a failed negotiation, Colonel Lee orders the Marines to storm the fire engine house. Within minutes, John Brown was wounded and captured, and 8 of his men, including his sons, were dead. Brown is charged with treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, murder, and inciting an insurrection. His case is expedited through the courts, and he's found guilty on all charges. When asked if he had anything to say, John Brown rises from his seat and eloquently begins a speech, denying any wrongdoing and saying that if his same actions had benefited the rich instead of the enslaved, he would have been rewarded rather than punished. He closes his statement with the following words: "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So let it be done." John Brown was hanged for his crimes on December 2nd, 1859. In the crowd that gathered to watch his execution were U.S. soldiers Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart, men who would later fight for the Confederacy against the country they had sworn to protect. Also watching from afar is John Wilkes Booth, the man who would later assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. John Brown makes no speech that day, but instead hands a small note he had written on a scrap piece of paper to his jailer as he walks up to the galley. "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, it might be done." And John Brown was prophetically right. His raid on Harper's Ferry equally stirred the hearts of abolitionists to the north and terrified slave owners in the south, who rapidly began to push for secession from the United States. In just over a year, the American Civil War began, and 750,000 Americans will die in the war to end slavery. As they marched throughout the country, Union soldiers began singing a song they called John Brown's Body as a rallying call. What began as a joke with crude lyrics evolved into a song detailing the life of a man who had given everything he had to end what he considered the greatest sin of his nation. This song was eventually rewritten into the Battle Hymn of the Republic, or as it is more commonly known, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah. Gary Plauché. It's 1983 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Gary Plauché is driving his 10-year-old son Jody to karate practice. Jody's been training under his 24-year-old instructor, Jeffrey Doucette, and Gary is proud of how much his son's improved. But at the same time, Gary feels bad for the guy. See, Jeff seems like a good guy, but he's struggling financially, so much so that it's pretty obvious he's been living at his karate dojo. So, wanting to help him out, Gary starts inviting Jeff over for dinner and occasionally lets him stay the night. Over the next few months, Jeff becomes a close family friend. To Jody, it was awesome having a cool older friend around so often. The two start spending a lot of time together, going to movies and traveling to different cities for karate tournaments. And to Gary, it was great that his son had a positive role model that he could trust to keep Jeff safe. But that trust was about to be broken in the most horrific way imaginable. On February 14, 1984, Jeff asks Gary's wife if he can borrow her car to visit his uncle and if Jody can come along for the ride. She doesn't see anything wrong with this, so she hands over the keys and tells them to have fun. A few hours later, Jeff calls and says they've decided to stay the night at his uncle's place and will be back the next day. But when the next day comes and goes with no sign of Jeff or Jody, Gary and his wife start to worry that something terrible may have happened. They contact the police, who begin searching for the boy and his instructor. But despite their efforts, there's still no trace of either of them. Hours turn into days, and Gary's worry slowly turns into dread that the worst has happened. The police soon launch a countrywide search to bring Jody back home, and all the while, Gary can't stop imagining all the horrible things that may have happened to his son. 2 weeks pass with no signs of Jody or Jeff, and the terrifying possibility that he may never see his son again begins to feel very real to Gary. But on February 29th, Gary's wife receives a collect call from a motel in Anaheim, California. When she picks up the phone, she hears Jody's voice on the other end. Thank God, he's alive! The police quickly trace the call and pinpoint Jody's exact location. 30 minutes later, Anaheim police storm into the Samoa Hotel, where they find Jody with Jeff in one of the rooms. They immediately arrest Jeff and take him into custody. As the officers question him, it turns out that after visiting his uncle, Jeff drove all the way to California and took Jody to see things like Hollywood and Disneyland while keeping him locked away in a motel at night. The very next day, the police take Jody back home to Louisiana. When Gary sees his son step off that plane, he rushes over and is relieved to have him back home safe and sound. Over the next few days, he struggles with the fact that someone he trusted so deeply, someone he welcomed into his home, had kidnapped his boy. But the reality of what actually happened turns out to be far more disturbing when Jody is taken for a medical examination. The police soon informed Gary and his wife that Jeff was not the man they thought he was. The examinations of Jody's body showed that while they were in California, Jeff had done some absolutely disgusting things to him. The detectives assigned to the case interview the little boy, and he tells them that Jeff had been molesting him for over a year. He was too scared to tell anyone this entire time because he did not want to lose his friend. When Gary hears this, his whole world shatters. He feels overwhelming guilt that he had put his son into such a horrible situation. But soon, this guilt turns to rage, and something inside him snaps. He decides that he cannot allow this monster any opportunity to get away with destroying his son's childhood, and will do whatever it takes to make sure justice is served. Jeff is charged with aggravated kidnapping and child molestation and is held in California while Louisiana authorities prepare the paperwork to bring him back to stand trial. But as the days pass and Gary waits for the criminal proceedings to begin, his rage continues to build, and he soon feels that no punishment the courts could come up with would ever be enough. For days, he visits a local bar, trying to drink his suffering away. And one night, a friend working at a local TV station happened to stop by and saw him. After making pleasantries, his friend casually mentions that his newsroom had heard that Jeff Doucette will be flown back to Louisiana on March 16th on American Airlines Flight 595. Upon hearing those words, Gary's eyes widen. He now knew exactly what he needed to do. On March 16th, Gary walks into Baton Rouge Airport disguised with a hat and sunglasses. He stands at a row of payphones in the main corridor and calls his best friend. As news crews arrive to film the return of Jeffrey Doucette, Gary keeps his head turned away from the cameras. Around 9:30 p.m., the police escort Jeff through the airport towards the main corridor. As they near the row of payphones, Gary tells his friend, who is still on the line, "You're about to hear a shot," and drops the receiver. In one fluid motion, he draws a revolver from his pocket, turns and fires a single bullet straight into Jeff's head as he's walking by. The police are shocked as they watch the man they were just escorting tumble to the ground. The officers rush in and grab the assassin and instantly recognize who he is. One of them screams, "Gary, why? Why, Gary?" as they pry the gun from his hand. Gary doesn't resist as the officers arrest him. Jeff is taken to the hospital in a coma but dies the following day. The assassination was filmed live as it happened directly in front of the local news crews at the airport, and the graphic images of the execution quickly become national news. As brutal a crime as was committed, many throughout the country identified with the father's desperate quest for revenge. Gary is tried for second-degree murder, but accepts a plea bargain in which he pleaded no contest to manslaughter. The judge ruled that there was virtually no risk of Gary committing any other crime, so he's only given a 7-year suspended sentence, 5 years of probation, and 300 hours of community service. He never goes to prison. When he was later questioned why he shot Jeffrey Doucette, Gary simply replied, "If somebody did it to your kid, you'd do it too." San Francisco Committee of Vigilance. It's 1848 and a man named Sam Brannan is visiting his newly opened store in what's now modern-day Sacramento. Just a few years earlier, Brannan, a Latter-day Saint, had fled religious persecution on the East Coast and ended up in California in a tiny port town that's now known as San Francisco. In his short time on the West Coast, he had started a newspaper, a flour mill, and now had just opened his first general store. Things are going pretty good for this young entrepreneur, but little did he know that his life would soon be changed forever, as a few rough-looking men entered his store looking to purchase some supplies. These men had come from Sutter's Mill up in Coloma. They pick out a few goods and bring them up to the counter to purchase. Brannan tells them what they owe, and instead of handing over coins, one of the men opens a leather pouch and pours a pile of gold dust onto a scale. Brannan can't believe his eyes. Who has so much gold that they can pay for things like this? So he makes a trip to Coloma to investigate what's going on at Sutter's Mill. He speaks to some of the workers there and finds out that they found gold in the American River. Tons of it. The men tell him there's so much gold here that all the people in California working together couldn't take it out in 50 years. Instantly, dollar signs flash in Brannan's eyes, but instead of brainlessly jumping into the river to find gold himself, he crafts what is perhaps the greatest marketing stunt in American history. Brannan returns to San Francisco and quickly begins purchasing every single pickaxe, shovel, and gold pan he can find in the area. He ships them all to his store in Sacramento and tells his employees to price these items at extreme markups. He then puts the gold dust he had received as payment into a glass bottle and steps out onto the streets of San Francisco. He holds up the bottle and loudly shouts, "Gold! Gold on the American River!" And the townspeople near him all stop their daily routines and turn to look. He holds out the bottle, and as it sparkles in the sun, he continues to shout his message over and over again. "Gold on the American River!" Brannan's plan works, and the news spreads through the town like wildfire. In a very short amount of time, nearly 75% of the men in San Francisco raced east to try to strike it rich. On their way to Coloma, they all stop at the only store with tools along the way, Brannan's General Store in Sacramento. In the first 9 weeks of the gold rush, Brannan makes $36,000, an equivalent of $1.4 million today, and he quickly becomes the richest man in California. But while Brannan's marketing stunt worked out better than he could have ever imagined, it led to some unintended consequences. News of gold in California spread throughout the world, and by 1850, San Francisco had exploded from a small port town of less than 1,000 people to a city of over 25,000. The massive boom of fortune seekers brought unprecedented levels of crime and lawlessness, and the local government with its small police force just couldn't keep up. Gangs of thieves and murderers begin to roam the streets of San Francisco freely without any fear. The worst of these criminals are the Sydney Ducks, a ruthless gang of ex-cons from Australia. They set fires to buildings to distract the police while they loot businesses, and anyone caught in their way often ended up dead. On the rare occasions the police managed to catch them, they just bribe corrupt officials and walk out of jail scot-free. On May 4, 1851, a fire set by the Sydney Ducks burned down around 2,000 buildings, which was more than half the entire city and caused over $10 million in damages. Brannan watched that fire rip through the city, and he decides that enough is enough. On June 9, 1851, he brings together a group of well-known citizens and businessmen. He tells them that the police are worthless and that if they want the crime to stop in their town, they would need to take justice into their own hands. Everyone in attendance agrees, and so on that night, they form a committee of vigilance to take back their city from these criminals. Conveniently, this committee did not have to wait long to take action. The very next day, a member of the Sydney Ducks steals a safe from a merchant's office. The members of the newly formed Vigilante group immediately track him down and hold a public trial. After finding him guilty, they hang him in front of a crowd of spectators. News of the trial and hanging quickly spreads through the city. Business owners who've had their shops looted and families who've lost loved ones to gang violence all realize they now have a way to fight back, and within weeks, the committee grows to over 700 members strong. Over the next 3 months, the committee hunts down every known criminal in San Francisco. They execute a total of 4 men and deport dozens more out of the city. The committee's extreme actions prove effective, and by September 1851, crime has dropped so dramatically in San Francisco that for the first time in years, people begin to walk the streets without fear. The committee members look around and decide their work is done, so they officially disband and hand back control to the local government. But by 1855, San Francisco is worse than it's ever been. But this time, the criminals have gone from the streets to wearing fancy suits. Almost every major position of power in the city is held by corrupt elites who use their influence to protect the criminal activity of their friends. Violent crime rates skyrocket throughout, and more than 480 people are murdered within the span of a year. The police do nothing. Sick of the corruption, a man named James King of William, who, by the way, called himself that to distinguish himself from all the other James Kings in San Francisco, began printing a newspaper called the Daily Evening Bulletin, and begins publicly calling out corrupt government officials. On May 4, 1856, King writes about a city supervisor named James Casey and exposes him as a convicted criminal who had once served time for grand theft before buying his way into public office. A few days later, he writes another article targeting a man named Charles Cora, a wealthy gambler who shot and killed a U.S. Marshal in cold blood. King demands the immediate hanging of Cora and calls out the court for delaying his trial to protect him. Cora and Casey happen to be friends, unsurprisingly, and not enjoying the recent publicity King has been giving them, Casey decides to fix this problem for good. On May 14, 1856, James King of William is walking down the street when Casey suddenly blocks his path. Casey menacingly asks the publisher, "Are you armed?" And before King can respond, he shouts, "Well, draw and defend yourself," and unloads a bullet directly into King's chest. King collapses onto the pavement and blood begins soaking through his clothes. Some bystanders rush him into a nearby office, where doctors immediately start fighting to keep him alive. Casey is arrested and taken to jail. As word spreads of the shooting, over 10,000 people gather in the streets outside of the building that King had been taken to, and murmurs begin to sweep through the crowd of a need for a second committee of vigilance. James King dies from his wound on May 20th, and just 2 days later, shortly after his funeral service, 3,500 armed vigilantes drag James Casey and Charles Cora out of jail and hang them in front of the entire city. The Committee of Vigilance was back, and this time it was bigger than ever. Over the next few weeks, the committee stormed through every government building in the city, searching for evidence of corruption. The vigilantes find a number of rigged ballot boxes which they displayed publicly as proof of election meddling they had suspected for years. They then not so subtly convince elected officials to resign from office. In an altercation with a California State Supreme Court justice, a vigilante is stabbed in the neck, and the committee takes the justice prisoner. This causes the federal government to call on a banker by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman to lead the local militia to stop the committee and their insurrection. But Sherman soon found out that most of the local militia wanted to fight for the Committee of Vigilance, not him. And so he quickly resigned, citing the whole fight as a lost cause. The committee's membership rapidly swelled, and within the span of a few months, they had hanged 4 men, deported dozens more, and had essentially taken over the corrupt local government, installing their own political party, which they called the People's Party. On August 11, 1856, having cleaned up the city once again, the committee voted to disband for good. As a final act, 8,000 armed vigilantes dressed in uniform then paraded through the streets of San Francisco with cannons and floats as a grand farewell. The committee's People's Party continued to manage the city until 1867. Oh, and if you're wondering what happened to Sam Brannan, the first millionaire of California who started the gold rush, he was excommunicated by the Mormon Church for his participation in the first committee, and later his wife divorced him and left him penniless. Bro could have really used a prenup. Today, we're going over the most epic deaths in human history. Number 1, Benkei. We're starting this video off with a story of the greatest wingman in human history. It's a dark night in 12th century Japan, and a Buddhist monk named Benkei is wandering the streets of Kyoto. With an abundance of temples dotting the city, monks are a common sight, but this guy is different. At 6'6", he towers over everyone around him, and he's carrying a weapon. A cross between a sword and a long spear called a naginata. His face gives off the vibes of someone on a hunt more than someone seeking enlightenment. And it turns out he was out hunting that night for his final victim. See, Benkei was actually a Sohei, a warrior monk trained and battle-hardened in combat. Through his encounters with samurai, he's decided that they were an arrogant class, unworthy of their status in society. The world would be a better place with less of them around, and this led him on a bloody quest to duel and defeat 1,000 samurai, collecting their blades as trophies after each victory. At this point, he had collected 999 swords and was out that night looking for his final duel. While walking near Goto Tenjin Shrine, Benkei hears the sound of a flute, and when looking to see who is playing it, he finds a small, thin samurai. Around the man's waist is a beautiful gilded katana, the perfect piece to finalize Benkei's sword collection. He immediately challenges this samurai to a duel. The small man puts away his flute, and surprisingly, he agrees to fight. The two men walk together to Gojo Bridge and draw their weapons. Full of confidence, Benkei rushes in, but despite towering over the samurai, Benkei is swiftly defeated. Instead of taking his life, the samurai just turns and walks away. Benkei is shocked and left in disbelief. In the following days, these unfamiliar feelings turn to anger and frustration. How could he lose to this tiny samurai? He had defeated much larger men in the past. He decides to stalk the grounds of Kiyomizu-dera Temple, waiting for the samurai to appear so he could take his revenge. Eventually, the samurai does show up, and Benkei immediately challenges him to another duel, a fight that Benkei loses again. Humiliated, he bows in defeat and tells this samurai that he'll abandon his life as a monk and instead follow him as one of his retainers. The samurai, who turns out to be Minamoto no Yoshitsune of the legendary Minamoto clan, agrees. Benkei joins him on his adventures, and the two become inseparable. They go on to join Yoshitsune's half-brothers and fight in the Genpei War against the powerful Taira, a clan that had killed Yoshitsune's father when he was just a baby. After 5 years of fighting, the Minamoto clan emerges victorious, and one of Yoshitsune's half-brothers, Yoritomo, becomes shogun. The end of the Genpei War had an unintended consequence. Without a common enemy, jealousy and suspicion soon turn the brothers against each other, and Yoshitsune and Benkei find themselves on the run, being pursued by Yoritomo and his men. They eventually find protection under another clan called the Fujiwara, and the pair spend a few years in relative peace in their domain. This ultimately did not last, as with a lot of pressure and probably a lot of bribes, Yoritomo finally convinces the Fujiwara to turn on his brother. Fujiwara no Hidehira, the man who was once their protector, betrays them, and on June 15, 1189, at the Battle of Koromogawa, Yoshitsune and Benkei find themselves trapped and outnumbered 5-1, with 500 of Fujiwara's men surrounding their castle position. The forces clash, and Yoshitsune's men put up a heroic effort. Benkei in particular is a demon on the battlefield, crushing enemies who are on average more than a foot shorter than him. But despite their best efforts, Yoshitsune's men quickly begin to fall. With just a handful of retainers remaining, Yoshitsune realizes the battle is already lost. He turns to Benkei and tells him he plans to commit seppuku within the castle. He'll need time to prepare, and Benkei understands the assignment. He walks to the bridge that serves as the only entrance to the castle and stands alone against Fujiwara's army. Fujiwara signals a charge, and wave after wave of his men charge Benkei. He cuts them down one after another. No man can make it past him. In some stories, he's said to have single-handedly slain 300 soldiers on that bridge. Benkei stands stoically behind a pile of deceased Fujiwara warriors, beckoning more men to cross. And despite orders to do so, none of the Fujiwara's men answer his call. They all know that stepping on the bridge was a death sentence. Fujiwara, realizing his men are now too afraid to attack Benkei head-on, calls in his archers. They'll take him out from a distance instead. The archers let loose a barrage of arrows that find their mark in Benkei's chest, but nothing happens. Benkei doesn't flinch. They let loose another volley of arrows, but still nothing changes. Benkei's body is now a pincushion of arrows, but is still standing defiantly in their way. Time passes, and both sides stare at each other across the bridge. Nobody dares to make the first move. Finally, Fujiwara orders some of his men onto the bridge, and they reluctantly do as they're told. As they slowly approach Benkei, he makes no motion to ready himself. They creep closer, and when they finally reach the massive monk, they discover that while he was still standing, he was already dead. Benkei, knowing he needed to buy as much time for his master as possible, had positioned himself to be supported by his spear even if he was no longer alive. In his last stand, he showed no pain or emotion while being hit with countless arrows, all to give the illusion that he was ready to fight anyone who dared to cross. Because of his final actions, Yoshitsune had enough time to commit the seppuku ritual properly, maintaining his honor. What a wingman! Number 2. Yisun Shin. The end of the 16th century in Korea was a strange mix of insane political corruption and relative peace for its people. Korea was a loyal tribute state to China, and the Ming dynasty pretty much left them alone. To the east, the Japanese were busy killing each other in the Sengoku Jidai, so they weren't a problem either. Aside from those pesky Jurchens who were constantly invading from the north, the rest of Korea was pretty boring and uneventful with no major threats. The boring, no wars way of life led to many men choosing to pursue careers as scholars and government officials, as it was now the best way to gain power and influence. This led to a bloated and corrupt political class and an extremely weak military led by generals who had never seen real combat. This combination of governmental corruption and a weak military would end up causing all kinds of problems in 1590 when Hideyoshi Toyotomi fulfilled the dreams of his former lord Oda Nobunaga and reunified Japan, bringing an end to the Sengoku Jidai. The Japanese, for the first time in over 100 years, were not at war with each other. And if they weren't busy fighting each other, who are they going to fight now? Oh. Toyotomi begins sending messengers to Korea, saying that he was planning to conquer China and that he expects the Koreans to help him or else. Now remember, Korea was basically like the Puerto Rico of China in this era, so they couldn't really help Japan conquer it. Not like they wanted to anyway. They thought the Japanese were primitive barbarians. Plus, those idiots don't even know how to sail anyway, right? Ha 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 ha. Oh. In 1592, hundreds of Japanese ships are spotted off the coast of Busan. This is no trading expedition, this is an invasion. Seeing the massive Japanese fleet, two of Korea's top admirals freak out and sink their own ships so they won't have to fight the Japanese. And just like that, half of Korea's naval fleet is gone. The Japanese soldiers land in Busan unopposed and immediately begin conquering forts and cities on their march to Seoul. The Korean military is no match for Toyotomi's men, who are all veterans of a 100-year war. Korean casualties are huge. The Japanese are ruthless and leave few survivors. Within 3 weeks, they've marched to and conquered Seoul. A few weeks later, they take Pyongyang and are at China's doorstep. The fall of Korea seems inevitable. But when all hope seemed lost, a man determined to defend his homeland and drive out these barbarian invaders rose to the occasion. A man who quite possibly was the greatest admiral to ever live. His name was Yi Sun-shin. So Yi Sun-shin's story is pretty interesting because unlike most heroes, he wasn't necessarily liked by the elites at the time. In fact, they kind of hated him, but for all the wrong reasons. Basically, early in his military career, he was so good at inspiring his men and leading them to victory that he made everyone around him look bad by comparison. Remember, corruption was a big problem during this time. So out of jealousy, a general falsely accuses Yi of deserting the army in battle, and the king believes it. He strips Yi of his rank, has him thrown in prison and tortured. This experience would probably make most men quit the military altogether, but Yi was eventually released, and he managed to climb his way back through the ranks to commanding a small fleet of ships by the start of the Japanese invasion. Now, despite the fact the Koreans were absolute trash at fighting at the start of this war, they did have one huge advantage over the Japanese. They'd been dealing with Woko pirates along the coast for years, and because of this, they had developed ships called Panoksun, and later the turtle ship that were specifically designed to combat Japanese naval tactics. See, the Japanese weren't used to fighting at sea, so they basically stuck to what they were good at, close-range combat. Their strategy consisted of shooting at people with their rifles and boarding other ships, and engaging them with swords and spears. Their ships were more like transport vessels rather than battleships. The Panoksun, on the other hand, was a floating fortress armed with cannons and was built in a way that made boardings impossible. These ships were a huge reason why Admiral Yi was able to have so much of his success, and are basically the only advantage the Koreans have. And they already sank over half of them themselves. Anyways, Admiral Yi was not a coward like the other two admirals, and instead of sinking his ships, he rushed his fleet of 34 ships headfirst towards the Japanese and began attacking them along the coast. His capabilities as a naval commander are obvious right from the start. In just a few weeks, using tactics to bait the Japanese to sail into vulnerable positions, he single-handedly sinks over 200 Japanese ships with no losses of his own. In battle after battle, he is vastly outnumbered, yet sails away victorious every single time. Yi is the sparkling piece of glitter embedded in the turd that is the Korean military, and by the end of the year, he had sunk 350 Japanese ships. Yi's efforts, along with the help of Chinese reinforcements, allowed the Koreans to drive the Japanese soldiers all the way back to Busan, and by the end of the year, the war entered somewhat of a stalemate, with the Chinese and Japanese trying to negotiate a peace deal. So things are going pretty good for Yi, But remember the two admirals who sunk their own ships at the beginning of the war? Well, one of them, named Won Gyeon, is insanely jealous of Yi's success. So jealous, he starts talking shit about Yi to the king every day. And when peace talks with China fail and Toyotomi begins a second invasion of Korea in 1597, Gyeon and other government officials frame Admiral Yi as a traitor, and the king agrees. For the second time in his career, Yi is stripped of his rank and sent back to prison where he is brutally tortured again. He's set to be executed, but the king has a change of heart, and he instead sends Yi back to fight as a common soldier, a humiliation worse than death. With Yi out of the picture, Won Gyeon is put in charge of the Korean fleet. And as you may have guessed by now, he was pretty terrible at his job. He drank heavily, made poor decisions, and disrespected his men. Many of Yi's commanders refused to fight under such a downgrade. And what made things even worse for Gyeon was that during the stalemate, the Japanese who had watched Admiral Yi wreck their over and over again had actually learned how to fight at sea. Their new ships now had cannons, and they began to use the same strategies Admiral Yi had used against them. This all comes to a head in the Battle of Chilcheoliang, Gyeon's first attempt to attack the Japanese fleet. With 200 ships and the best of Admiral Yi's men, Gyeon sails out to confront the Japanese, and he immediately falls into a trap. A trap they had learned from fighting against Yi. The entire Korean Navy is decimated, and Gyeon is last seen being chopped to bits by Japanese soldiers while trying to run away. The king, realizing he may have messed up, reinstates Yi Sun-shin as fleet admiral, and he takes command of the pathetic remains of the once undefeated Korean Navy. He's left with just 13 ships and a few hundred demoralized men. In the following battle, outnumbered 25-1, using superior strategy, Yi manages to sink 31 of the 333 Japanese ships, again without losing a single ship of his own. This victory gives Yi time to rebuild his navy, but not gonna lie, things still look pretty grim for the Koreans. But the next year, Hideyoshi Toyotomi becomes ill and dies, his last official order being to withdraw the Japanese army from Korea back to Japan. Yi sees this as the time to finally drive the Japanese out of Korea for good and mounts a final offensive against the retreating Japanese forces. At the decisive Battle of Noryang, Yi takes his position at the top of his flagship with his son and nephew and begins beating a war drum to push his allied Korean and Chinese fleet forward. Admiral Yi's ship leads the charge, and he personally takes out 10 Japanese ships. The Japanese are in full retreat, and Yi beats his drum with intensity. Victory is within his grasp. After 7 long years, Korea will finally be free of these invaders. But suddenly, he's hit in his armpit by a Japanese musket ball. He realizes the wound is fatal, and he turns to his son and nephew and says, "The war is at its height. Wear my armor and beat my war drums. Do not announce my death." His son and nephew quickly carry his body below deck, and his nephew, dressed in Yi's armor, quickly returns to the admiral's position and resumes beating the drum. Yi's men continue to fight, and the Koreans drive the Japanese out of Korea for good. Undefeated in battle, Yi dies below deck, listening to the sound of his drum, knowing that his homeland was finally free. Number 3. Ben L. Salomon. So we generally cover stories from more ancient times on this channel, but this story from World War II undeniably belongs on this list. This is the last stand of a dentist turned field medic who took out 98 Japanese soldiers before falling to his own wounds. Ben L. Salomon was drafted into the United States Army in 1940, just 3 years after he graduated from the USC Dental School. Salomon proved to be a model soldier and showed himself to be very skilled with both rifle and pistol. He was quickly promoted, first to lieutenant and then to captain in 1944, serving as a regimental dental officer of the 105th Infantry Regiment. In June of 1944, Salomon and the 105th were deployed into active combat in Saipan. The fighting in the Pacific was infamously bloody. Casualties on the island were extremely high, and with so many soldiers having much more pressing issues than a root canal, Salomon volunteered to replace the 2nd Battalion's field surgeon who had been wounded. By July, both the Americans and the Japanese had suffered heavy casualties, and the remaining Japanese troops on the island came to the realization that there was no path to victory. They decided on a final banzai charge, a mission with the sole goal of killing as many American soldiers as possible with no plan of returning. Early in the morning of July 7, 1944, the remaining 4,000 Japanese soldiers began their final attack. Salomon's field tent was positioned just 50 yards behind the front foxholes, and within minutes, his tent quickly filled with over 30 injured troops. He did his best to tend to the wounded, but the Japanese soon broke through the front lines. He looked out of his tent and spotted a Japanese soldier bayoneting a wounded American who was lying outside of the tent. Enraged, Salomon picked up the rifle of one of his patients and fired at the Japanese soldier, killing him. Suddenly, 2 more Japanese soldiers popped into Salomon's tent and he fired on them, taking them out as well. Like zombies, 4 more enemy soldiers then crawled into the tent from the sides, and Salomon took 2 out with his rifle and another with his bayonet. He hit the 4th soldier in the stomach with the butt of his gun, and a wounded soldier he had been treating finished him off. Realizing the situation was only getting worse, Salomon instructed his medics to evacuate all of the wounded men. He would stay behind to give them cover so they could retreat. Salomon grabbed a rifle and joined the front lines. When he saw 4 men manning a machine gun fall to enemy fire, he rushed to the gun and manned it himself, firing bursts into the charging Japanese soldiers. He continued to fight from that position until he was eventually overrun by enemy soldiers. Days later, when the Americans returned to the battlefield, Salomon's body was found slumped over the machine gun, with 98 dead Japanese soldiers piled in front of him. His body was ravaged with 76 bullet holes and many bayonet wounds, 24 of which he may have suffered before actually dying. The blood trail on the ground showed that Salomon had repositioned the machine gun multiple times while mortally wounded. Despite saving many lives that day, Salomon was denied the Medal of Honor due to a rule in the Geneva Convention that no medical officer can bear arms against an enemy. Despite multiple recommendations from generals throughout the years, he remained a footnote in history until 2002, when Salomon was finally posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor from President George W. Bush, 58 years later. Here are more of the most epic deaths in history. Number 1. Galvarino. On November 8, 1557, a group of 100 Mapuche warriors are being escorted by Spanish conquistadors back to their camp as prisoners of war. The Mapuche have been fighting with these invaders for over a year now, desperately trying to defend their homeland, and though their bravery is unmatched, they're outclassed in both weapons and armor against these barbaric foreigners. Walking amongst the prisoners is a man named Galvarino. He and his fellow warriors have just been defeated in the Battle of Lagunias, and instead of simply being executed on the spot, he's being saved for a much more devious plan. See, the leader of the conquistadors in Chile, the governor Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza, is tired of dealing with these natives who keep attacking them, and he comes up with a solution that hopefully will bring an end to this constant harassment. The Spaniards and their prisoners arrive at the camp, and Governor Mendoza orders his men to mutilate each of the Mapuche warriors. Many are to have their noses and right hands cut off, but more skilled warriors like Galvarino will instead have both of their hands chopped off to make sure they can never fight again. The conquistadors begin to execute this brutal punishment, and the warriors cry out in pain as their noses and hands are savagely cut off. When it's his turn, Galvarino calmly places his hand on the chopping block. Without hesitation, a man wielding a hatchet severs Galvarino's right hand at the wrist, leaving just a bleeding stump. He makes no sound, and showing no emotion, he puts his left hand onto the chopping block, which the Spaniard also chops off without hesitation. Galvarino then rests his head on the chopping block and demands that they kill him to finish the job, but this was not what Mendoza wanted. See, the mutilation was not meant to kill the Mapuche. Instead, he wanted to send a message to the tribe. That message being, anyone who dared to stand in their way will meet a similar gruesome fate. The governor releases the now disfigured warriors, and they return home with instructions to give this warning to their fellow natives to never fight the Spaniards again, or this will be your inevitable future. But when Galvarino returns home, he does not tell the Mapuche to stop resisting, and instead holds his stumps up in the air and shouts, "The damage they have done since they entered our realm, and what they've done to me, is what they will continue to do if we're not diligent in destroying these injurious people." He demands that the Mapuche must do everything they can to fight these invaders and defend their homeland. His speech is so rousing that he's promoted to a war chief and is placed in charge of the counterattack against the Spanish. This is a pretty sick promotion, but remember, he doesn't have his hands anymore, so doing anything more than strategy might be a little challenging. But Galvarino is not content to simply lead from behind. He wants revenge, so he has knives lashed to the stumps of his mutilated wrists, becoming a human weapon, and he'll lead from the front. So on the dawn of November 30th, Galvarino and a large group of Mapuche warriors stage an ambush on the camp of Governor Mendoza. Knowing the Spaniards had horses and cannons, the plan was to start and end the battle quickly before the invaders could organize themselves. But something goes wrong. A miscommunication, and some of the warriors miss their cue and begin charging too early. Galvarino raised his knifed stub, yelling, "Nobody is allowed to flee but to die, because you died defending your mother country." He then rushes ahead to the front of the charge to lead his men into battle. The Mapuche rush in, and Galvarino is aiming for Governor Mendoza's head. On his rampage through the camp, he cuts down the general second in command with his knives. But as bravely as they fought, the Mapuche were still armed with simple clubs and spears. Though the Spaniards were caught off guard by the initial attack, it did not take long for them to ready their cannons. Explosions soon sent shockwaves through the battlefield, and a hole is punched through the Mapuche offensive. Their mounted cavalry storm in, and the battle quickly turns into a slaughter. By noon, 3,000 Mapuche warriors are slain, and 800 more are captured, including Galvarino. He's brought to Governor Mendoza for a second time, and a Spanish aide near him, seeing his knifed stumps, begins to request mercy for him. He asks Galvarino if he'd like to join them and fight alongside the Spanish forces. To which he replies, "I would rather die than live like you, and I'm only sorry that my death will keep me from tearing you to pieces with my teeth." Okay, never mind. The 800 captured men are all executed, mostly by hanging, but reportedly in some stories, Galvarino was given a more brutal punishment and fed to the governor's dogs, who tore him apart alive. Number 2, Constantine XI. It's the mid-15th century and things are not looking too great for Constantine XI. Though he's technically an emperor, he has no empire left to rule. All that's left of the once mighty Eastern Roman Empire is a single city, Constantinople. The land surrounding his city, all once Roman territory, is now controlled by the more powerful Ottoman Empire, and Constantinople is a mere tribute state that pays a heavy tax to the Ottoman Sultan for a right to even exist. This in itself might not have been that big a deal. Sure, there wasn't really an empire anymore, but hey, at least the Romans still exist, and maybe Constantine would have been content ruling just his little city for the rest of his life. But there was one major problem. See, according to Islamic prophecy, a great Muslim ruler will one day conquer the legendary city of Constantinople, and because of this quote-unquote fun fact, a lot of Muslim rulers have tried to take the city for themselves over the years. So far, they've all failed to do so, but in 1451, a young sultan named Mehmed II takes the throne of the Ottoman Empire, and the only thing he wants is to become this legendary ruler of prophecy and be the one who finally conquers Constantinople. Now, Constantine is no idiot, and when he sees Mehmed constructing a huge fortress right across the Bosphorus Strait, he knows something is coming, and he desperately starts trying everything he can think of to get someone to help him. He tries to marry a bunch of princesses from various countries in Europe to create allies, but nobody wants to marry him. He goes to the Pope and says he'll merge the Eastern Orthodox Church back into the Catholic Church to try to convince the Pope to send Catholic nations to help him. But this just pisses everybody off in Constantinople, so that didn't work. He hits up his fellow Christian superpowers like Genoa and Venice for help. He even tries to bargain with Mehmed himself to just let him keep the city, but there is no amount of money in the world that can get him to change his mind. After all his efforts, just a handful of ships and soldiers are sent from Europe to help, and Constantine is left to defend what's left of the Roman Empire against the Ottomans all alone. Now, as fortune would have it, around this time, a Hungarian cannon expert named Orban hears that Constantine is in this desperate situation, and he goes and tells him that he can make some weapons for him that would help him fight off any invader. Specifically, he has a special, never-before-seen mega cannon that is so powerful it can turn the tide of any battle. Constantine is super excited. Finally, his prayers are being answered, but he's crushed when he hears the price that Orban wants for his services, and he just doesn't have enough money to pay him. He tries to negotiate and offer what little money he has, but Orban refuses to deal and walks away. So with a tiny army of just 7,000 men, Constantine begins preparations for the inevitable Ottoman siege. He reinforces the great Theodosian walls that have withstood foreign invasions for centuries and strings a giant chain across the Golden Horn to prevent ships from attacking the city from the water. Some people think he's a crazy doomsday prepper, but Constantine is soon proven right at the end of 1452, when a horde of Ottoman soldiers begins setting up camp around Constantinople. Giant catapults and trebuchets are wheeled onto the field, along with something the Romans had never seen before. Wait, what the heck is that thing? You gotta be f***ing kidding me. See, Orban couldn't make a deal with Constantine, but with Mehmed, well, no price was too steep if it helped him achieve his dream of becoming the ruler of prophecy. So Orban's mega cannon called the Basilic was wheeled out and aimed directly at the front gates. Constantine cannot believe the size of this thing. It's 24 feet long and its cannonballs are the size of boulders. Finally, on April 6th, after months of preparation, Mehmed begins his siege. It's 100,000 Ottoman soldiers versus just 7,000 men who are to defend Constantinople. Cannons ring out and punch holes into the great walls surrounding the city, and arrows rain down on Constantine and his men. On April 11th, Orban's mega cannon is fired, and the explosion is so large it kills the Ottoman soldiers operating it instantly. The 1,200-pound cannonball leaves a giant crater in Roman defenses. Though outnumbered and outgunned, the Romans fight bravely, and against all odds are able to repel the Ottoman forces who get into the city twice. Every night, Roman men, women, and children desperately race to patch holes in the great walls before morning. Everyone's trying to chip in and save all that's left of their once great society. A small fleet of ships from Europe make it past the Ottoman blockade and bring supplies into the city, and the Romans begin to think, hey, maybe we got a shot at winning this. But suddenly, a string of mysterious, almost biblical bad omens begin to occur, which slowly eat away at the hopes and dreams of everyone within the city walls. First, on the night of April 22nd, a lunar eclipse blocks out the moon. Local prophecy had stated that the city would fall when the moon lost its light, and the sight of this freaks the citizens out. That alone would be bad enough, but the omens didn't stop there. Next, in early May, a strange mist rises from the ground around the sacred Hagia Sophia Cathedral. The citizens take this as the Holy Spirit that had once protected them, leaving them to fend for themselves. The Romans attempt to hold a religious procession to call up the Virgin Mary to save them, but as they were walking, the painting of Mary being carried in the streets falls out of the priest's hands and onto the ground. The crowd gasps as even the Mother Mary has forsaken them. And perhaps the most ominous sign happens a few days later when fire is seen dancing in the sky above the Hagia Sophia, striking the chapel, signaling their impending doom. This fire was most likely a natural phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire, but they didn't know that, and to the average citizen, it just seemed like God had abandoned them and they were all doomed. These bad omens weighed on no one's mind more heavily than Constantine, who did his best to convince his citizens that these were in fact good omens, but deep down he was troubled that these truly were signs from the divine that his empire was at its end. Regardless, he and his men continued to fight on, but by May 28th, the once impenetrable walls defending the legendary city had been reduced to a giant pile of rubble, and it became clear that night that the Ottomans would stage an all-out assault the following day. Many of his advisors urged Constantine to flee the city and fight another day, but he refuses and instead conducts a church service, the final Christian service ever held within the Hagia Sophia. He finishes the night with a speech recounting the greatness of the Roman Empire and all of the heroes who have come before them. He reminds his soldiers of their ancestors and their Roman heritage and implores every man to fight to the end to defend this history. The speech steels his men, and not one abandons his post. The next day, as expected, the Ottomans storm the city with their entire force and quickly breach the walls. The Romans and their allies fight bravely, but it soon becomes clear that the day is lost. Ottoman flags are flown atop the ruined walls, and Constantine can do nothing but watch the chaos unfold in front of him. The empire of Romulus and Remus, of Augustus, of Constantine the Great, and Justinian will all end today. His advisors again beg Constantine to flee. The ships are ready, and many others are already boarding and leaving for Europe, but he refuses. The city is fallen, yet I am still alive, he laments as he watches more Ottoman soldiers pour into his city. He then removes his crown and royal markings and rushes headfirst into battle as a nameless Roman soldier. He is never seen again. Number 3. Sergeant Gander. In 1939, a black Newfoundland pup named Pal is brought home by a local family in Newfoundland, Canada. He's a playful dog with lots of energy. He grows to be so big that the family's children often ride him or have him pull them around on sleds. He's a good boy, but his large size is quickly becoming an issue. And one day, while playing with some neighborhood kids, Pal accidentally scratches the face of one of the children. Pal was too much dog for the family, and they decided instead of putting him down, to donate him to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Rifles of Canada that were stationed nearby in Gander, Newfoundland to be their mascot. When Pal arrives, he's initially a little scared, but the men instantly fall in love with him and rename him Gander after the location of the base they're stationed at. When not on duty, the soldiers would play with him, and now Gander can be as rough as he wants to be. He eats together with them, drinks beer with them, and sleeps with them in the bunks. They even promoted him to sergeant and gave him stripes to match that get attached to his collar. At last, Gander has finally found his family and his home. But in October of 1941, the British forces are spread too thin across Europe and needed help defending their colonies in Asia. The Royal Rifles are deployed to Hong Kong to defend it against a Japanese attack. Not wanting to leave Gander all alone, the men bring him with them across the Pacific. For the first 3 weeks, life isn't much different in Hong Kong than it was back home. Just a few routine patrols here and there, but on December 8th, the day after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese begin their assault on the European colonies in Asia. The combined British and Indian forces massively underestimate the Japanese fighting capabilities, and in a few short days, their entire fighting force is pushed off of mainland China and onto Hong Kong itself. The Royal Rifles are stationed on Hong Kong to defend the Lai Mun Gap, which is the part of the island that is closest to mainland China, and when thousands of Japanese soldiers begin pouring onto the island, the Royal Rifles find themselves under heavy fire as the first line of defense. The fighting is intense, but throughout it all, Gander is right there on the front line fighting with his fellow Canadians. Any Japanese soldier who gets too close is tackled by what they can only describe as a black monster. The Japanese had never seen a dog this big and have absolutely no idea what it is. As the Canadians send rounds at the invaders from their bunkers, they catch glimpses of Gander chasing Japanese soldiers away, barking and biting at their heels. On December 19th, the battle is raging well into the night, and a group of injured Canadian soldiers are waiting to be taken off the battlefield when a grenade suddenly lands right in front of them. The men try to scramble away, but it's no good. They're all too injured to move, and they can do nothing but watch the grenade and wait for their inevitable doom. But out of nowhere, Gander dashes in, picks up the grenade in his mouth, and takes off toward the Japanese line. The men's relief quickly turns to horror when they realize what has just happened. They helplessly stare out into the darkness, and a few short seconds later, they hear an explosion a short distance in front of them. Gander had saved their lives at the cost of his own. The Canadian forces surrender to the Japanese on Christmas Day, and many of the soldiers are taken to prison camps where they're interrogated about the black demon they had trained to fight with them on the battlefield. In 2000, Gander's bravery was finally recognized by the United Kingdom when he was posthumously awarded the Dickin Award, the animal equivalent to the Victoria Cross.
Today we're going over extreme survival stories of people who refused to die. John Coulter. It's 1809, and frontiersman John Coulter and his friend John Potts are paddling a canoe up the Jefferson River. The two men are hunting for beaver pelts on this expedition, and they both know that they have just crossed into some very dangerous territory. Just a few years earlier, Coulter was part of the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition that mapped the previously unexplored American West. While traveling in what is now Montana, the party had some not-so-friendly encounters with the native Blackfeet Indians, who have lived in this region for generations. These tribes had begun working with British fur companies and now saw the American presence in the area as bad for business. Coulter could not help but notice the demand for beaver pelts was skyrocketing, and so, in 1806, 2 months before the official end of the expedition, he asked to be honorably discharged, and he chose to stay out in the wilderness to try to strike it rich. But John was soon given a lesson on just how much the local tribes did not appreciate American fur trappers on their turf. In 1808, the Blackfeet had ambushed him and shot an arrow in his leg. Had the Flathead and Crow Indians he was traveling with not chased them away, he would have been dead. Now well aware that the Blackfeet did not want them around, the duo were doing everything they could to avoid them at all costs. Coulter and Potts continued rowing in silence, hoping that they could pass through unnoticed. But as they turned the corner, a cold shiver ran down their spine as hundreds of Blackfeet warriors began stepping out of the forest and onto the riverbank. The natives don't seem to be very interested in doing business, and they gesture for the men to come to them. Coulter knows they don't have a lot of options here, so he nervously brings the canoe to shore. The instant he steps onto land, the Blackfeet strip him naked and take his rifle, knife, and gear. As he watches Coulter being stripped bare, Potts begins to imagine the horrific things the Blackfeet have in store for them, and he refuses to get off the canoe. The warriors begin to lose their patience, and one of them shoots an arrow into him for his stubbornness. Potts, now bleeding, panics and grabs his rifle. He fires at one of the warriors, and instantly the Blackfeet return, a storm of arrows that turn his body into a pincushion. Horrified, Coulter can do nothing but stand there and watch as Potts is dragged ashore and hacked to pieces. He assumes he's next, but instead, the chief unexpectedly points to the open prairie and tells him to run. Coulter couldn't believe what was happening. He was being spared, and so he takes off, sprinting butt naked as fast as he could. He gets a few hundred yards away when suddenly, war cries echo out in the distance behind him, and it dawns on him that he had not been set free after all. He was simply given a head start. This was a hunt and he was their prey. Naked, alone, and now running for his life, Coulter sprints ahead. He knows that about 6 miles away is the Madison River. If he can just make it there, he may have a chance of getting away. Every step drives sharp rocks into his bare feet, and his legs are ripped up by shrubs. But Coulter pushes himself harder than he ever has before. His lungs burning, he keeps running until his vision starts to blur and blood begins pouring from his nose from the sheer strain. After traveling what felt like a few miles, he stops to try to catch his breath and turns to see if he had lost the Indians. To his horror, one warrior had caught up and found him and was now just 20 yards away. Exhausted and knowing he can't outrun the man, he quickly turns to fight. The Indian, who is running at a full clip towards Coulter, is startled when the naked white man suddenly whips around and aggressively raises his arms towards him. He stumbles to the ground and breaks his spear. On instinct, Coulter rushes over, grabs the broken spear, and drives it into the warrior, killing him. The frontiersman takes a blanket the young Blackfoot was carrying, and as a group of warriors draws near, he takes off running again. He reaches the river, bleeding from his feet and nose, barely able to stand. He can hear the natives getting closer behind him. His legs are completely dead, and he begins desperately searching for somewhere to hide. As the voices of the warriors grow louder and louder, Coulter spots a beaver lodge and dives into the icy water. He swims beneath the lodge and finds a small pocket of air just big enough to keep his face above the surface. Alright, the beaver lodge was probably empty, but I thought it was funny. Anyways, when the Blackfeet arrive moments later, there is no sign of the naked white man they had been pursuing. They circle the area for hours, and Coulter does his best to remain perfectly still beneath the lodge as the freezing water numbs his entire body. After what seems like an eternity, night falls, and the sounds of the Blackfeet warriors fade into the distance. In near darkness, Coulter slips back into the river and swims a few miles downstream. He crawls ashore, shaking and half frozen, but he is alive. For the next 11 days, with just the blanket he stole from the warrior, he keeps moving through harsh terrain, surviving on roots and berries. He forces his broken body more than 300 miles through mountains and valleys, until finally he reaches a trading fort on the Little Bighorn. As he stumbles in, he is nearly unrecognizable. He's thin, exhausted, and bleeding everywhere. But, against all odds, he lived to tell the tale. Leonid Rogozov. It's September 1960, and a 26-year-old surgeon, Leonid Rogozov, steps off his ship and onto the frozen continent of Antarctica. A few months earlier, the Soviet Union had announced its 6th Antarctic expedition and was looking for a doctor willing to spend 2 years at the Novozorevskaya station, one of the most remote research stations on Earth. Leonid had been studying to become a surgeon, but when he heard the news, he dropped everything and quickly applied to join the expedition. He's chosen and is assigned to join the 13-man research team as its sole doctor. As Leonid excitedly walks to the station, he can't believe how quickly his life has changed. But he is completely unaware that soon he would be fighting for his life with nothing but a scalpel and a mirror. By January 1961, the station is fully functional, and Leonid settles into his role as the only physician for the crew. For the first few months, everything is going according to plan, and luckily, the researchers seem pretty good at keeping themselves healthy in these extreme conditions. But on the morning of April 29th, Leonid wakes up and something is not right. He feels weak and nauseous. By midday, he's running a fever and a sharp stabbing pain has moved to his lower right abdomen. Leonid knows that this could be very bad. These are all hallmarks of appendicitis, something that can be life-threatening if not treated immediately. So, he starts taking antibiotics and presses ice against his abdomen. He's hoping the infection is minor and this will be all it takes to clear it up. But by the morning of April 30th, the pain is so bad he can barely move. His fever keeps climbing and he begins to vomit uncontrollably. The antibiotics were not enough. This infection had progressed to the point where the outlook was now very grim. His appendix could rupture, and if it did, he would only survive hours to days without proper treatment. The nearest Soviet research station with another doctor is over 1,000 miles away, and to make things even worse, a severe blizzard had rolled in, making it impossible for any planes to land at Novozorevskaya to rescue him. The researchers at the station watch helplessly as their doctor's condition continues to worsen. There's nothing they can do. and they realize they may have to helplessly watch him die. Leonid stares at the ceiling of his small room, his mind running through all of his options. In the end, he decides surgery is the only thing that can save his life, and he is the only person who can do it. He recruits 3 of his colleagues to help him as assistants, and he begins prepping himself for surgery. He orders one of the researchers to hold a mirror near his abdomen so he can see what he's doing during the surgery. He places another researcher near his tools so he can call for them as needed, and he gives the third man a shot of adrenaline and instructs the researcher to stand by and use it on him if he passes out. At 2 a.m. on May 1st, Leonid nods to his assistants, adjusts himself into a half-sitting position, and injects himself with a local anesthetic. Looking at the mirror, he picks up a scalpel and makes a 4-inch cut on his right side. He continues to cut through layers of muscle and tissue, but he struggles using the mirror to see and eventually begins working through touch alone. He can feel the warmth of his blood seeping out over his hands as he searches for his appendix. As he's working blindly in the hole he had cut into himself, he accidentally cuts his large intestine. Leonid quickly calls for sutures, and he's forced to sew it back together before he can continue to his appendix. 40 minutes have now passed, and his vision begins to blur. His head starts to spin, and he becomes nauseous. He begins to take short 30-second breaks every 4 minutes to regain his focus, using all of his concentration to not black out mid-surgery. After almost an hour of cutting and feeling around his abdomen, Leonid finally locates his appendix. But at that exact moment, he feels his heart rate slow, and his hands begin to lose sensation. He battles back through the brink of blacking out, grips his scalpel, and quickly removes his appendix. As he inspects it, he sees a dark stain at its base and deduces that if it was not removed, it would have burst within a day. He fights through the vertigo and nausea and sews himself back together. Nearly 2 hours after he had made the initial cut into himself, the surgery was completed, and Leonid, exhausted both mentally and physically, collapses on the table. Over the next few days, he continues to suffer from a high fever, and his colleagues worry that their doctor still won't make it. But on day 5, his fever finally breaks, and in 2 weeks, Leonid is back on his feet performing his regular duties. Operating on yourself and then continuing to do your job as if nothing had happened is, not gonna lie, kind of impressive. And I guess even the Soviet government thought so too, as Leonid was later awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor for his bravery and service to the Soviet state. Julianne Kopka. It's December 24th, 1971, and 17-year-old Julianne Kopka is sitting next to her mother as their plane takes off into the sky. A day earlier, Julianne had graduated from high school in Lima, and now she's finally going back home to spend Christmas with her dad. Her parents were world-renowned zoologists who were living at a research station they'd established deep in the Amazon rainforest. The original plan was for Julianne to return to the research station a few days earlier, but wanting to participate in her graduation ceremony, she convinced her mother to stay with her and fly back on Christmas Eve instead. But being Christmas, all the flights out of Lima were booked solid, and the only airline with available seats was LANSA, an airline with a poor reputation for safety. Julianne's father urged his wife not to book with LANSA, but thinking this was a short 1-hour flight, Julianne's mom booked the tickets, and they were now aboard LANSA Flight 508, heading home. Their plane climbs to cruising altitude, and everything seems fine. But roughly 30 minutes after takeoff, Julianne looks out the window and sees dark clouds and flashes of lightning surrounding them. The pilot had chosen to fly directly into a thunderstorm, and soon the entire aircraft began shaking violently. The aircraft is tossed in the storm, and luggage is rattled out of the overhead bins. Passengers begin to scream with every bump as the plane moves more and more erratically. Julianne holds her mother's hand tightly, but both are unable to speak out of fear. Suddenly, the panic in the cabin is drowned out by a massive bang from outside. When Julianne looks back out the window again, she sees that the plane's right wing is on fire. Terrified, she looks to her mom, who looks back at her and calmly says, "That is the end. It's all over." The plane's engines scream louder and louder as it drops into a nosedive, and within seconds, it begins to tear itself apart mid-air. Passengers are flown into the open sky, and when Julianne opens her eyes, the cabin is gone. Wind is ripping past her as she falls towards the rainforest below, still strapped into her bench seat. As the tree line accelerates towards her, she passes out. When she opens her eyes, it's the next morning. She was unconscious while it happened, but the rainforest canopy and the airplane seats she was strapped into had broken her fall, just enough to keep her from dying on impact. Somehow, she is still alive. She immediately calls out for her mother, but nobody answers. As she tries to stand, her head begins to spin from a brutal concussion. She stumbles through the wreckage, desperately searching for other passengers, but she is completely alone. As she checks herself, she realizes her collarbone is broken. She also has a deep gash along her right arm, a badly wounded knee, and an injured eye. To make matters worse, she's lost her glasses, and being short-sighted meant she was now nearly blind to the dangers lurking around her in the rainforest. But there was one thing that Julianne had that perhaps no one else who may have survived the crash had. During the 18 months she lived with her parents in the Amazon before high school, she learned the basics of how to survive in the jungle. She remembered that the best chance of survival in a situation like this was to find a river, because if she followed it long enough, it would eventually lead her to people. As she moves through the scattered wreckage, she finds a bag of sweets. With that as her only food, Julianne pushes forward through the thick jungle. For days, she hobbled through the rainforest alone, the calls of the animals around her providing an eerie soundtrack to her hike of desperation. At night, the cold winds leave her shivering as she curls up in a bush to try to sleep. As the days pass, the wound on her arm becomes infected, and botfly maggots start eating into her open flesh. On the fourth day, she finds a stream and begins to follow it. As she turns a corner, she sees something that sends shivers down her spine. In front of her are 3 dead passengers from her flight, all still strapped to their seats with their heads buried into the ground. It's the first time Julianne had ever seen a dead body, and she is initially frozen in fear. She works up the courage to approach the bodies to check the woman, dreading the idea that this could be her mom, but finds that the corpse's toenails are painted, something her mother never did. Staring at the passengers, the last bits of hope she was holding onto begin to slip away. She gathers herself and forces onward. The sound of moving water grows louder, and the creek suddenly opens into a wide river. She knows that if she continues to walk along the river, she could maybe find her way out. But after 10 days of stumbling through the forest, she is reaching her limit. Her bag of sweets ran out days ago, and now she was so weak she could barely stand. Just as she is about to give up, she spots a small boat tied to the riverbank. Using the last of her energy, she makes her way to the boat. She notices a narrow path leading into the trees, and it takes her to a small hut. She's saved! But when she gets there, no one is there. By now, the maggots in her arm were nearly 1 inch long. She remembered something her father did for one of their pets in the past, and she finds a can of gasoline in the hut. She sucks the gas out of the can and spits it onto her wound. The pain is excruciating as the maggots try to burrow deeper into the wound to escape the fuel, but she is able to pluck 30 of them out of her arm. Exhausted, Julianne falls to the ground inside the hut and falls asleep. The next morning, she wakes to the sound of voices and runs outside. When the men see Julianne, they are terrified and initially think she's a half-dolphin water goddess. But speaking in Spanish, she explains to them what happened. She was on the flight that crashed, and she is all alone. They treat her wounds, feed her, and the next day bring her back to civilization. Julianne is soon reunited with her father and learns that her mother is still missing. Officials continue to search for her mother, but her body is eventually found in January. She had also survived the plane crash, but was too injured to move and died a few days after the incident in the jungle. Of the 92 people aboard LANSA Flight 508, Julianne was the only survivor, and, in fact, she's still alive today.
You're born to an aristocratic family in Brussels in 1880, and your parents named you Adrian Carton DiWiart. Your mom's Irish, and your dad's a powerful Belgian lawyer and diplomat. Or at least that's what your mom says. There's a lot of rumors going around that your real dad was actually King Leopold II, the King of Belgium. Not really someone you'd want to be related to anyway. Your mom dies when you're 6, so nobody finds out if that's true or not. Your father remarries, and he and his new wife decide the best thing for you would be to study law in England. Your dad really wants you to follow in his footsteps, and he chooses a prestigious boarding school in Oxford. So you go and try to make your dad happy. But while at school, you start to learn about war, and it sounds amazing. So amazing, in fact, you decide that you're going to go to war as soon as you can. You finally get your chance when war breaks out in South Africa in the Second Boer War. Just one problem. You're only 19, and the age requirement to enlist is 20. Not to mention, you're not actually British. No matter, you make up a fake name, Trooper Carton. Say you're 25 and submit your application. If the British don't take you, you'll go fight for the Boers instead. The British don't run a background check, and you're off to South Africa to fight for Team Britain. Actual war is so much more intense than the teachers made it seem. Trenches, mud, barbed wire, explosions, people dying everywhere. It's everything you hoped it would be. You notice that the enemy has set up barbed wire that's preventing your allies from advancing, so you go to your colonel and ask for permission to run up and move the barbed wire out of the way. He calls you a fool and says no. Super lame. But you soon learn why he called you that when Boer snipers shoot you in the stomach and groin. These injuries send you to the medics, who discover your real identity, and you're shipped back to Oxford as soon as you're healed. Back in Oxford, all of your classmates think you're super cool and a hero, but you're depressed that your war experience was dull with no glory. You stay in the British Army and are deployed to India, where it's super boring. You spend most of your time getting jacked and hunting. After serving the crown for 8 years, you finally become a British citizen. In 1914, you're really itching to get back to war, so you go ahead and sign up to get shipped out to British Somaliland. You're gonna get to ride a camel and fight some guy they're calling the Mad Mullah. You're super excited. But as you're on the way to Africa, the absolute worst thing that you could ever imagine happens. The Great War breaks out, and Britain declares war on Germany. The other soldiers are gonna get to fight the best army in Europe, and you're stuck on a boat, heading to Africa where you'll be riding a camel and fighting this Mad Mullah guy. Ugh. You decide to make the most of it and rush out to the front lines to fight the dervishes. They're pretty aggro, and maybe fighting here isn't all that bad. You sneak up on the enemy, so close that you can touch them with your walking stick, and they see you and begin shooting at you. You get shot twice in the face and get hit in the eye and the ear. You get shipped back to England, and your eye is so messed up, they can't save it, and it's removed. This actually worked out really well, because now you can ask to go fight in the Great War. The front lines in Europe really need experienced officers just like you. But there's a problem. They don't want to send a guy with an eye patch to the front lines because they think it'll make the army look weak. They say they'll let you go if you wear a glass eye. You agree and sign the papers to get yourself deployed. On the way home, you remove your glass eye and toss it out the window of your taxi and put on a black eye patch instead. You're sent off to France to fight in the Great War, and boy, this one is even more intense. Trenches, barbed wire, artillery shells exploding all over the place. Oh, it's everything you hoped it would be. You wander up to the front lines, and everyone keeps telling you to duck for some reason. How are you supposed to see all the explosions if you keep ducking? Your second in command comes up and tells you, "I really wish you would duck when those shells come." Just before you can answer, another shell comes and knocks you both off your feet. You stand up, dust yourself off, and see a hand next to you. That glove looks familiar. Ooh, that's not good. You march your men forward through the trenches and find some dead German bodies on the road ahead. It looks pretty suspicious, so you and your men go to investigate. Aha! Just as you expected! A trap! And now they're shooting at you! You get knocked to the ground, and when you try to push yourself up, your left hand isn't working right. Ooh, that's not good. Your palm is completely shot through, and your fingers are barely hanging on, only attached by some skin. And the worst part? You decided for the first time ever to wear a wristwatch that day. Well, now that watch is blown to bits and embedded in your arm. You run and make it back to the medical tent and ask the doctors to pull off your fingers. They tell you no and say it would be too dangerous. Oh my God! For the next few years, surgeons try to save what's left of your hand, and eventually you get sick of them failing, so you ask them to just cut it off. So now you got one eye and one hand, and you get yourself back into the trenches. You find yourself at the Battle of the Somme. Over 1 million soldiers will die in this battle, and you're right in the thick of it leading the charge. On July 3rd, 1916, you lead your division to attack La Boisselle, one of the strongest German-held positions. The offensive is brutal, but you're leading your men well, firing at the enemy, pulling grenade pins with your teeth, and encouraging your troops. By night, all of your fellow commanding officers are dead or wounded. Out of nowhere, you're suddenly knocked to the ground and you quickly check yourself for wounds. Hand? Check. Eye? Check. Head? Uh-oh. The back of your head has been blown off by a machine gun bullet, but luckily, it missed all the vital parts. Okay, alright, seriously, what does that even mean? You spend 3 weeks in the hospital for this one, but while there, you receive the prestigious Victoria Cross for your efforts at the Somme. This just makes you want to go fight some more, so as soon as you can, you're right back in the thick of things. First, at the Battle of Passchendaele, where artillery fire catches you on the hip, blowing off your clothes. Next, at the Battle of Cambrai, where you're shot in the leg and almost lose it. And then at the Battle of Arras, where you get shot in your other ear. By this point, the generals and the doctors are all urging you to stop going back out to the front lines. But what do they know? In another one of your medical stays, you're lying in a stretcher, upset with yourself at just how quickly you found yourself back in the hospital, and a clergyman making his rounds spots your sour face. He approaches you, observes your eye patch, and tells you, "Cheer up, it could have been much worse. A few months ago, I saw a man come through here who was missing both an eye and an arm." You ask him to tell you the name of this soldier, and the clergyman replies, "General Carton DiWiart." What? The war ends and you find life pretty boring back in England. So you move to Poland, where literally every one of their neighbors are trying to destroy them. You get to fight against the Soviets, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, the Czechs. It's everything you hoped for. While living in Poland, you try air travel and end up in an airplane crash, but survive. You decide to take a train instead on your next diplomatic mission, but your train is attacked by Cossacks, and you have to fire at them while hanging off the back of the train. You fall off and quickly scramble back on, all the while continuing to shoot at them till they disappear. Poland is nice, and you retire and spend the next 16 years there hunting every single day. Life is good. Until a failed Austrian painter starts another massive war in Europe. Poland is quickly invaded by both the Soviets and the Germans, and you barely make it out of there alive. You eventually make it back to Britain, and at 60 years old, you're given your old rank and sent out to fight the Germans in Norway. Your mission is to take Trondheim, but the situation is horrible. In your opinion, the Allied soldiers in this war are nothing compared to the ones that fought in the first one, and the Germans are kicking your ass. Eventually, your unit is pulled back, and you end up in North Ireland. You think your military career is over, until you get selected for a special diplomatic mission to Yugoslavia. You board a plane in Cairo and set off for Belgrade, hoping that this plane doesn't crash this time. Your plane crashes off the coast of Italian-controlled Libya, and when you swim to shore, you're quickly arrested. You're identified as a valuable prisoner and moved to Italy, where you remain captive for 3 years. You attempt to escape 5 times, and on the last attempt actually make it out and spend 8 days in northern Italy disguised as a civilian who spoke no Italian and had an eye patch and was missing his hand. Di giorno. You're recaptured again, and eventually Italy wants out of the war. They use you as a bargaining chip with the British and offer to dress you in a fine Italian suit. You tell your captors you won't object to free clothes, as long as they don't make you look like a gigolo. You get sent back to Britain, and shortly after, your good friend Winston Churchill asks you to be his representative in China. You fly there, this time without crashing, and you quickly take a liking to the Chinese people. Though there's one person in particular you're not too fond of. This guy Mao Zedong seems to love communism, and you do not like it one bit. In a dinner where he's giving a speech, you interrupt him and tell him he's wrong, and that he should spend less time yapping and more time attacking the Japanese. Mao, startled, looks at you for a bit, then laughs. Japan finally surrenders in 1945, and you participate in the formal surrender ceremonies as one of the representatives for Britain. As the war is over, you finally retire for good at the age of 67. On your way back home, you make a stop in French Indochina and slip on a coconut mat, breaking a few ribs and knocking yourself unconscious. Luckily, you survived because that would have been a terrible way to go considering everything else you'd gone through. You retire to Ireland and write your memoir and eventually pass away peacefully at the old age of 83. In your autobiography, you reminisce on your time in the Great War and write, "Frankly, I enjoyed the war."
Today we're going over the most epic survival stories in history. Poon Lim. It's November 23rd, 1942. and 24-year-old Poon Lim is desperately clinging to a wooden plank in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. Just moments earlier, he had been a steward aboard the SS Ben Lomond, a British merchant marine ship on its way to New York. Without warning, two massive explosions ripped through the vessel, and Lim was swept overboard. Fighting against the pull of the now sinking ship, he frantically swam toward what he hoped was the surface, his lungs burning for air. When he finally broke through, he looked around only to see the endless ocean stretching in every direction. He was completely alone. As he bobbed in the frigid water, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him, the German U-boat that had fired the torpedo suddenly surfaced. Its crew climbed onto the deck, and Poon Lim waved frantically, shouting for help. The Germans spotted him and burst into laughter. They mockingly waved back before again disappearing beneath the waves, leaving him to die. After 2 agonizing hours of drifting, Lim spotted a sign of hope. One of the few life rafts the crew of Ben Lomond had managed to launch before the ship went down was floating just a few hundred feet away. He desperately swims toward it and drags himself aboard. In the distance, he sees another raft carrying a handful of other survivors, and they begin waving for him to join them. But with no oars to steer, the raft slowly drifted apart until once again, he was completely alone. Aboard the raft, Lim finds some food, water, and signaling supplies. He began rationing carefully, clinging to hope that rescue would come soon, but days stretched into weeks, and his supplies dwindled to nothing. Realizing he would probably run out of food before he was rescued at this rate, Lim made a desperate decision. He would save his last piece of hardtack not to eat, but to use as bait. He fashioned a fishing hook from the spring in his flashlight and unraveled hemp rope for a fishing line. Surprisingly, the fish seemed to like the hardtack more than the sailors ever did, but his hook was too small to catch anything substantial. Using a nail he pried from the raft, he made a bigger hook and used the small fish he had been able to catch as bait. As his fresh water supply ran out, he rigged a canvas shelter to catch rainwater to drink. When seagulls began landing on his raft, Lim caught them for food as well. With no way to cook the birds, he butchered them, soaked the meat in seawater, and dried it into jerky under the scorching sun. Though the supplies he found on the raft had completely run out, he was now catching enough food to survive. But then the rain stopped completely, and soon he was left with nothing to drink. Sunburned and delirious with thirst, he watched as sharks began circling his raft. In this moment, Lim comes up with an idea only a man staring at death could come up with. Using seagull remains as bait, he tries to catch one of the sharks. He gets a bite and he uses all of his strength to pull the giant fish out of the water. Desperate beyond reason, he cuts it open and drinks the blood from its liver. A few days later, a cargo ship appears and Lim shouts to them in English, begging them to save him. But they ignore his request, the crew assuming he was a Japanese sailor. Later, American Navy patrol planes spot him and drop to buoy to mark his location for rescue. But before they could return, a violent storm swept Lim and his raft away into the vast ocean. Months pass, and Poon Lim gives up counting the days he has been lost at sea. Starving and sunburned, he's about to give up. But one morning, while gazing out at the water, he noticed something different. The color of the ocean had changed. He had drifted closer to shore. But where was he? And more crucially, could he survive long enough to be found? Finally, on April 5th, 1943, 4 months after the Ben Lomond's sinking, a Brazilian fishing boat spotted him just 9 miles off the coast of northern Brazil. Using the last of his strength, he stands and shouts for help, and the fishermen come to his rescue. By this point, Lim had lost 20 pounds and was so weak the fishermen had to lift his emaciated body from the raft into their boat. In a Brazilian hospital, Lim learned he was the sole survivor from his ship. He had survived for 133 days, drifting alone in the Atlantic Ocean. Poon Lim makes a full recovery and is later told that no one had ever survived longer on a raft at sea. He quickly replied, "I hope no one will ever have to break that record." Hugh Glass. It's August 1823, and a fur trapper named Hugh Glass is traveling along the Grand River in what is now modern-day South Dakota. This particular expedition was deep into Arikara Indian territory, which made it particularly dangerous, but soon, Hugh would be fighting for his life against something much more fierce. While scouting ahead of his party for river crossings, Hugh inadvertently stumbles upon a mother grizzly bear with her cubs. The mama bear, on instinct to protect her young, lunges at Hugh and instantly begins to maul him. The bear tears deep gashes on his back and chest, exposing his ribs, breaks his leg, and slices his throat. The other trappers hear his screams and come running, finding Hugh being literally torn apart. They open fire, finally bringing down the beast. Hugh lies in a pool of his own blood, a mangled wreck that barely resembles a human being. Everyone present knows they're looking at a dead man walking. Or, rather, a dead man that had just been crumpled into a pretzel, I guess. They fashion a makeshift stretcher and drag him along for 2 days, but his weight slows their progress to a crawl through dangerous territory. Expecting Glass to die at any moment, the expedition leader offers $80 for volunteers to stay with him until the end and give him a proper burial. An old trapper named John Fitzgerald and a young man named Jim Bridger step forward, thinking they've just scored the easiest money of their lives. But days pass, and Hugh Glass refuses to die. Fitzgerald and Bridger watch as Hugh drifts in and out of consciousness. Each time they think he's gone, he lets out another painful groan. Poor old Hugh. It won't be long now. Yep, any minute. Oh my god, just fucking die already. 5 days pass and Hugh is still not dead. The trappers begin to panic. What if the Indians find them? They'd be sitting ducks. Hugh is obviously not going to make it, and there's no reason for him to take them with him. So in a moment of cold calculation, they decide to take Hugh's rifle, knife, and supplies and abandon him alone in the wilderness. Fitzgerald and Bridger quickly catch up with the main expedition and report that Hugh Glass had passed away. The other men accept this without question. After all, they'd seen what the guy looked like when they left. But against all odds, Hugh Glass did not die. And he finally wakes up only to find himself all alone and stripped of all his weapons and supplies. Enraged that Fitzgerald and Bridger had left him to die, he tries to stand but discovers his shattered leg won't support him and his entire body is covered with deep wounds. With grim determination, he sets his own broken leg and begins an impossible 200-mile journey toward Fort Kiowa, crawling on his belly like a broken animal. Every day he drags himself a few agonizing miles, eating berries, roots, bark, and bugs to survive. Maggots hatch from fly eggs in his festering wounds and begin devouring the rotting flesh on his back, which is super gross, but actually probably saved his life by preventing a deadlier infection that would have killed him. While any sane man would have surrendered to death, Hugh is driven by one burning obsession: revenge against the men who betrayed him, so he continues to drag himself along the river. But by this point, Hugh was starving. The berries and bugs he had been eating were not enough. He discovers a pack of wolves feasting on a freshly killed buffalo calf. When the wolves leave, he crawls to the carcass and claims it as his own, setting up camp and gorging himself on meat until his leg heals enough for him to limp onwards. Hugh reaches the Missouri River, and there, some friendly Lakota Indians give him a boat which he uses to float downstream. Finally, in October of 1823, Hugh Glass limped into Fort Kiowa. Against all odds, he had survived not only a vicious grizzly bear attack that should have killed him, but also a 6-week, 200-mile journey back through the wilderness, all alone. Now, for most people, surviving such an ordeal would probably be the end of their life on the frontier. But Hugh Glass couldn't forget the men who had left him to die. He wanted revenge, so as soon as he fully recovered, he bought a new rifle and supplies and set out to hunt down Fitzgerald and Bridger. For months, Hugh tracked through the wilderness, following the trail of the expedition that had written him off as dead. And on New Year's Eve, 1823, he walked into Fort Henry and found his former companions. The trappers stared in absolute terror as they watched a man who they thought was dead walk directly towards them. Once they confirmed he wasn't a ghost that was trying to haunt them, they peppered Hugh with questions, which he answered patiently. Finally, it was his turn to speak, and Hugh just had one question of his own. Where are Fitzgerald and Bridger? Bridger is called, and the young man cannot believe his eyes. Though Hugh intended to kill him, their conversation reveals that Fitzgerald was the one who decided to abandon him. Hugh forgives the young man and sets out to find and kill Fitzgerald, who had since left the party. For the next 6 months, Hugh wandered from fort to fort, searching for his betrayer, and finally, in June 1824, Hugh Glass walked into Fort Atkinson and finds Fitzgerald. Hugh draws his gun and walks into the fort, but is stopped by a U.S. Army captain. Hugh demands a face-to-face meeting with Fitzgerald so he can give him what he has coming to him, but his long-awaited revenge was immediately crushed. The captain informed Hugh that Fitzgerald had enlisted in the U.S. Army and was now government property. He would not allow Hugh to harm him. Glass pours out his story about how he was abandoned and left for dead by Fitzgerald, and the captain understands how that probably was pretty infuriating, so he tells Hugh to wait a moment. He returns with Hugh's rifle that Fitzgerald had taken and $300. Happy to have his rifle back, but still bummed he couldn't get his revenge, Hugh shouts a warning to Fitzgerald, who remained in hiding. Never leave the army! Because if you do, you'll be dead. Hugh Glass then turns and leaves the fort, returning to life as a fur trapper, which he does for another 10 years until the Araucarians finally killed him. Bro really should have retired. The HMS Endurance. It's December 5th, 1914, and Sir Ernest Shackleton is sailing toward Antarctica aboard the HMS Endurance with a crew of 27 men. The early 20th century was the golden age of Antarctic exploration, and Shackleton was one of the greatest heroes of the era. In a previous expedition, he had come within just 97 nautical miles from becoming the first man to reach the South Pole, but he was forced to turn back when he ran out of supplies. Before he could attempt it again, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen beat him to the prize, which was super frustrating. Now 40 years old, Shackleton knew time was running out on his career as an explorer. If he wanted to secure his place in history, he would need to achieve something even greater than reaching the South Pole. And that was exactly what this expedition aimed to do. Shackleton planned to be the first man to walk across the entire Antarctic continent, passing through the South Pole. This would probably take an entire Antarctic summer. His team would need to be perfect, but Shackleton was confident they could make history by accomplishing the impossible. But as the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea, Shackleton and his crew could see that something was not right. This should have been the peak of the Antarctic summer. Yet due to unusual weather that year, the sea was choked with ice. As the Endurance pushed closer towards the continent, the ice grew thicker and more threatening, and by January, the ship was completely frozen in place. Shackleton's crew tried desperately to chip away the ice and free the Endurance, but it was hopeless. Soon the brief summer season had passed, and without any other option, they were forced to wait until the ice would break during the next spring. For 8 brutal months, the crew survived on the ship, enduring the savage Antarctic winter. Shackleton worked tirelessly to maintain his men's morale, organizing games and sing-alongs, but in his private journal, he confessed his deepest fears about their situation. His only goal now was getting his men back home alive. In September 1915, the ice around the Endurance began to melt. The crew initially celebrated, thinking they were finally free. They had no idea their nightmare was about to become so much worse. As the ice melted, massive chunks began pressing against the ship. As the pressure from the ice sheets grew worse, the damage became so bad that by October 24th, water was pouring into the cabin. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship, and the crew frantically unloaded supplies onto the ice sheet before watching the Endurance disappear beneath the surface forever. Shackleton hoped the ice sheet would drift them close enough to an island where he had cached supplies, but as the Antarctic summer progressed, the ice literally melted beneath their feet. Food grew scarce, and eventually, the sled dogs were shot to provide meat for the starving crew. Shackleton led desperate marches across the shifting ice floe, trying to reach solid land, but every attempt failed. They had to establish new camps while the ice was rapidly disintegrating beneath them. On the evening of April 8th, the ice sheet the crew was camped on suddenly began to split apart. Shackleton immediately ordered his crew to load the 3 remaining lifeboats from the Endurance and set off as their previous campsite crumbled apart. As they sailed through the night, one boat was lost in the darkness, crushing the spirits of the survivors. Shackleton had initially planned to head for Deception Island, but it proved deceptively difficult to reach. With his crew freezing in -20 Fahrenheit temperatures, he was instead forced to land on the barren wasteland of Elephant Island. As the men from the 2 surviving lifeboats unloaded their meager supplies, they spotted something miraculous on the horizon. The 3rd lifeboat had somehow found them. The crew reunited in tearful celebration, but reality soon set in. Elephant Island was a frozen hell. No whaling ships visited this desolate rock, and it had virtually no wildlife to sustain them. If they remained here, it would mean a slow, cold death for everyone. These men had trusted Shackleton with their lives, so he decided to risk his own to save them. He ordered his carpenter to repair and modify one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, which he and 5 others would use to attempt an 800-mile journey to South Georgia Island. He selected navigator Frank Worsley to join him, and he would assign him the near impossible job of guiding their tiny boat across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, using only a map and a sextant. Shackleton packed enough food for 4 weeks, assuming that if they hadn't found land by then, they would have overshot their target and would be doomed anyway. The 6-man crew launched from Elephant Island on April 24th, putting their lives entirely in Frank Worsley's hands. For 14 hellish days, the James Caird was battered by 20-foot waves while ice formed on the boat and crew. Worsley navigated from memory and the few precious hours of daylight each morning provided. Finally, on May 8th, South Georgia Island appeared through the mists like a mirage. The tiny boat made landfall 2 days later. Against all odds, Worsley had successfully guided them to their destination. Though they had made it to the island, the 6 men were far from rescued. The James Caird had landed on the south side of the island, while the whaling stations Shackleton desperately needed were on the opposite side. He could either try sailing around the island, risking being blown off course, or attempt something that had never been done, climbing over the glacial mountains that stood between him and civilization. Shackleton chose Worsley and another sailor to accompany him on his final gamble. With no map to guide them, they set out at 2 a.m. on May 19, 1916, and began up the mountain. By dawn, they had climbed to 3,000 feet and could see the whaling station in the distance, but they were heartbroken to discover they were traveling in the wrong direction. They had to backtrack and continue through the night in complete darkness. By the next morning, they could make out the whaling station far below, and at 7 a.m., they heard a steam whistle, the first human sound they had heard in 2 years that wasn't their own. On the morning of May 20th, 3 skeletal figures with matted hair and wild beards stumbled into the Stromness whaling station. The whalers didn't believe the man claiming to be Ernest Shackleton. He had disappeared 2 years ago and was presumed dead. Only when Shackleton called the station manager he had met prior to the voyage by name did they finally believe him. Shackleton immediately convinced the whalers to help him rescue his men. The very next day, the 3 crew members from the James Caird, who were stranded on the other side of South Georgia, were rescued by a whaling boat guided by Shackleton himself. 3 days later, Shackleton set off in a whaling ship to rescue the rest of his men on Elephant Island. But winter was setting in, and the island was surrounded by an impenetrable ice pack. Shackleton desperately attempted to reach Elephant Island in July, but the ice was still too thick, and an August attempt also failed. 3 months had passed since Shackleton had left his men on that frozen rock, and he begged the Chilean Navy for assistance. They provided him with a steam tug that finally broke through to Elephant Island on August 30th. As the fog lifted around the ship's approach, Shackleton wondered if anyone could still be alive. He had left them in such a horrible place, but soon he was overwhelmed with relief as he saw his men waving at him from the shore. They had survived, every single one of them, and within an hour, they were all aboard the rescue vessel. Against all odds, every member of Shackleton's crew from the HMS Endurance had survived 2 years in the most hostile environment on Earth. When Shackleton planned another Antarctic expedition in 1922, many men from the crew of the Endurance volunteered to join their captain on another adventure. Tragically, just before this new adventure could begin, Shackleton died of a heart attack on South Georgia Island. the very same island where he had risked everything to save his crew just 6 years earlier.
Today, we're going over some of the most extreme stories of betrayal from human history. Number 1. Ricimer. Okay, we're kicking things off with a betrayal so extreme that it caused the actual fall of Rome. It's the 5th century AD, and the once mighty Rome has seen better days. Collapsing in on its own immense size, the Roman Empire split into 2 separate empires in 395 CE. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, seemed to take the breakup well and thrived for another 1,000 years or so, while the Western Roman Empire... they were struggling to keep it together. See, Rome was like that beautiful neighborhood that was once a great place to live that went to complete shit after decades of corruption and bad leadership. Germanic tribes like the Visigoths and Vandals were constantly invading around the borders of the empire, and without the political stability to field a proper army to defend itself, late Roman emperors were forced to rely on local barbarian generals and their armies of mercenaries. These barbarian generals grew in power and influence, and eventually the emperor was nothing more than a puppet figure to these warlords. To make things worse, Rome was hit with a wave of massive inflation that devalued its currency and made everything so much more expensive for its citizens who were already struggling to get by. The sacking of Rome by the Vandals in 455 CE seemed like the final death blow to the once mighty empire. But out of the rubble emerged a man who saw the chaos as an opportunity to seize power for himself. This man was named Ricimer, and he was going to do it all with the help of his best friend, Majorian. Ricimer and Majorian were friends forged in war. They fought side by side in numerous battles against barbaric invaders and rose through the ranks together. Both grew to become respected commanders, and many throughout Rome began wishing for one of them to take control of the empire and guide it back to greatness. And here's the thing. They both wanted that power, so much so that they worked together to orchestrate a coup against the Emperor Avitus, who they thought was doing a horrible job. With Avitus gone, Ricimer became the most powerful man in Rome. But there was one problem. Ricimer wasn't technically Roman. He was actually one of those barbarian generals mentioned before. And although Ricimer was the more decorated commander with better qualifications when compared to Majorian, not being Roman made him ineligible for the throne. So he decided he would instead get his best friend promoted to emperor and simply influence Majorian's decisions and rule over Rome from the shadows. Majorian becomes emperor in December of 457, and Ricimer could not have been more happy. That is, until Majorian started doing a little too well. See, Majorian actually turned out to be a phenomenal emperor, and he had his own ideas on how to make Rome great again. And his ideas, they were good. Majorian quickly took back large swaths of lost territory and dramatically reduced the corruption in the Senate. He instituted sweeping changes which made the lives of Romans much better, and in just a few short years, there was a glimmer of hope that the Western Roman Empire could possibly return to its former glory. This unexpected success pissed Ricimer off. This was not how it was supposed to go. In his mind, he was the one who would restore Rome's glory, not stupid Majorian. But before he could do anything about it, Majorian had already reclaimed most of Italy, France, and Spain, and he now planned a massive campaign to reclaim Rome's lost African territory. In preparation for this expedition, Majorian amassed a huge fleet in Cartagena, but under mysterious circumstances, the entire fleet was set ablaze just before the invasion, with whispers that Ricimer might have had a hand in it. The loss of the fleet was a huge blow, and Ricimer seized the moment and, using a combination of lies and bribes, tries to convince the Senate that Majorian was unfit to rule. Majorian, unaware of Ricimer's actions in Rome, traveled to see his old friend for advice. Majorian arrives unarmed and without guards, because why would he ever need that? This is his oldest and most trusted friend we're talking about. Well, the feelings were no longer mutual, and Ricimer and his men go out to meet Majorian on the road. Without flinching, Ricimer has Majorian arrested and kills all of his companions on the spot. He strips Majorian of his imperial clothing and then imprisoned and tortured him for 5 days. Throughout his time in captivity, Majorian wonders out loud why his friend would do this to him. Eventually, Ricimer had Majorian beheaded and unknowingly sealed the fate of the country he loved, as the empire would soon fall apart without a true leader. Ricimer tries to institute new puppet emperors, but they all fail, and Rome finally falls in 476. Number 2. Qin Hui. For this story, we're headed to 12th century China for a legendary betrayal of one of the greatest generals in history. A boy named Yu Fei is born on a farm in southern China in the early 1100s. This is a time of great instability, as the Jurchens from the north are at war with the rulers of China, the Song dynasty. As a young child, Yu Fei's father passes away in a flood, and he's raised by his mother, who instills a fierce sense of patriotism to his country. When the Jurchens begin invading Song territory, Yu Fei, now a man, is torn between his strong desire to defend his country and his dedication to take care of his now elderly mother. His mother asks him to remove his shirt, and she tattoos on his back the words, "Serve the country with utmost loyalty." Probably took up less space in Chinese. Anyways, now with his mother's blessing, Yu Fei joins the military and shows incredible skill in martial arts, weapons, and military strategy. When the Jurchens conquer the Song capital city of Kaifeng, Yu Fei joins the front lines and begins fighting on the northern battlefront. In combat, Yu Fei proves to be unstoppable. Legends of his bravery begin to emerge, and one story says he led 500 men to defeat an army of 100,000 Jurchens. He rises quickly through the ranks and soon finds himself commanding an army of loyal men known as the Yu Army, and he goes on to rack up an undefeated record against the Jurchens. What makes Yu Fei special is that throughout all the fighting, he maintains his humanity and shows extreme kindness and compassion for his soldiers. He personally tends to his wounded men, and when any of his men fell in combat, he would instruct his wife back home to send their own money to the soldier's family. For the next 10 years, Yu Fei and his men fought tirelessly to claw back the conquered northern Song territory, and he becomes a national hero. By 1140, he's within striking distance of the fallen capital city of Kaifeng. His dream of unifying China is now within reach. But if there's one guarantee in life, it's that success often breeds jealousy in others. As Yu Fei prepares for the final advance on Kaifeng, he receives orders to return home. See, the problem for Yu Fei is the former emperor of the northern Song dynasty was still alive and being held captive by the Jurchens. If Yu Fei was able to win and retake the city, this most likely would free the former emperor, and that would cause all kinds of problems for the current ruling class of the southern Song dynasty. Who would be the rightful ruler of the land? What would happen to those in power now? These were questions the officials close to the current emperor didn't want to have answered. A man named Qin Hui, a close advisor to this emperor, saw Yu Fei's growing influence as a huge threat. He convinces the emperor to make peace with the Jurchens, and just as Yu Fei is about to storm the city, the Song sue for peace and say they'll pay a tribute to the Jurchens. Yu Fei is furious upon hearing this news, but he begrudgingly follows his orders and returns south. All the land he had fought to regain is quickly recaptured by the Jurchens, and he can do nothing but watch. The fighting and the deaths of his men over the last 10 years were all for nothing. When Yu Fei returns to the capital, Qin Hui convinces the court to imprison him for conspiring against the emperor. He's thrown into a dark cell and subjected to months of torture in an attempt to force a confession. But Yu refuses to admit to crimes he never committed. Yu Fei eventually dies in prison at the age of 39. Some report that Qin Hui had him poisoned in his cell. Decades later, the truth of Qin Hui's involvement in Yu Fei's death was revealed, and statues of Qin Hui and his wife in a kneeling position were erected in front of Yu Fei's tomb as a symbol of their wrongdoing. For centuries, these statues attracted people from all across China who would come to pee and spit on the man who killed the greatest general China had ever seen. Number 3. Akechi Mitsuhide. We couldn't do a video on betrayals and backstabbing without doing at least one story from the Sengoku period in Japan. The Sengoku Jidai was a nearly 150-year civil war that took place in 15th and 16th century Japan, where regional warlords called daimyo fought to become the great unifier of the country. In this chaos, a minor daimyo from the Owari province named Oda Nobunaga began his rise to power using erratic and unconventional tactics, which quickly proved effective on the battlefield. Now, the thing about Oda that you should know is that he wasn't like most other lords. He dressed flamboyantly and was often seen with messy, undone hair. His behavior was fairly crude compared to most daimyo. He would make fun of his men and was known to have an irrationally quick temper. For example, he once had a retainer killed on the spot when he showed up late to an important meeting. Keep all of this in mind because this is probably what gets him killed later. Anyways, this weirdness also seemed to help Oda in war, and after winning a string of decisive battles against more powerful daimyo, he began to attract powerful allies and retainers. Many began to believe he was destined to be the one to reunify Japan. Nobunaga had many trusted generals and retainers, but the two we'll be focusing on for this story are Hideyoshi Toyotomi and a man named Akechi Mitsuhide. Toyotomi was a young military genius, while Mitsuhide specialized in diplomatic relations and governance. Oda trusted and relied on Akechi to help him govern his lands and quell rebellions, and while he was very loyal in return, he was sort of the odd one of the bunch. For starters, he was much older than many of the other retainers. He was even older than Oda himself. This, combined with the fact he was more educated than Oda, all made it hard for him to handle the disrespect that Nobunaga was known for. For example, in one story, Oda grabbed Akechi around the neck and said, "I'm going to make your head into a drum," and then proceeded to bop Akechi's head with a fan while singing a song making everyone in the room burst into laughter. But perhaps the biggest insult was the time Oda got Akechi's mother killed. In 1579, Akechi was ordered to capture Yakami Castle after the Lord Hatano Hideharu rebelled against Oda. As part of a peace agreement he negotiated, Akechi gave his mother to Hatano's men as a hostage in exchange for Hatano turning himself in with dignity. Hatano accepted the deal, and the exchange was made. Akechi's mother would stay with Hatano's men as insurance, and Hatano would travel with Akechi to see Oda to apologize. When Hatano arrives to meet with Nobunaga, he has him executed on the spot. Word of Hatano's death traveled quickly to Yakami Castle, and his men quickly kill Akechi's mother in retaliation. Now, whether or not these things were the actual reason for betrayal, we'll never know, but Akechi secretly begins to plot against Oda, and this all comes to a head in 1582. By this time, Oda has all but conquered Honshu, the main island of Japan. The last few unconquered domains are weak and will soon surrender, and Nobunaga has all of his best generals out in the field ready to crush them. He orders Akechi to take his army of around 13,000 men to support Hideyoshi against one of these last holdouts, the Mori clan. Nobunaga himself goes to Honnoji Temple to relax and prepare to join Akechi and Hideyoshi in the final glorious battle against the Mori. Honnoji is deep within Nobunaga's territory, in Kyoto, and because of this, he doesn't feel the need for much protection. He enters the temple for his stay with virtually no guards. Early in the morning on June 21st, 1582, Akechi and his men surround the temple and without explanation begin an all-out assault. They begin slaughtering priests and Oda's companions as they make their way through the temple grounds. With virtually no guards, Oda tries to fight back, but is quickly overpowered and injured. He retreats deep into the temple to commit seppuku, but before he dies, he orders his retainer to set the temple on fire so his body will never be able to be recovered. The temple is soon engulfed in flames, and Nobunaga's body is lost amongst the ash. With Oda dead, Akechi declares himself shogun. When word of Nobunaga's death reaches Hideyoshi, he quickly makes peace with the Mori clan and heads back to find Akechi to avenge his master. I gotta go. So can that guy, just kill himself? Okay. Thanks. Hideyoshi heads back to Kyoto, and Akechi is now scrambling for support. To his horror, because he cannot prove that he was the one who killed Nobunaga, no one wants to help him. Hideyoshi and Akechi fight in Kyoto at the Battle of Yamazaki, where Hideyoshi crushes Akechi's forces in just 2 hours. Akechi is killed as he tries to run away, and Hideyoshi assumes control of Oda's territory. Akechi's time as the self-proclaimed ruler of Japan lasted just 13 days. Number 4. Massacre of Glencoe. This last one is crazy because George R.R. Martin has said that this was one of the inspirations for the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. It's the late 17th century Scotland, and while the area had been conquered and annexed by the British, the area known as the Highlands still remained largely run by family clans. These clans were groups of people connected by a common ancestor and were ruled by a clan chief who served as the protector of his extended family. Of course, like all neighbor situations, there were disputes and the occasional "he said, she said, you stole my goat" conflicts. But generally, these clans got along, intermarried to strengthen bonds, and tended to trust one another as fellow Highlanders. Above all else, the Highlanders were famous for their hospitality towards guests, as it was the most ingrained and important part of their collective culture. Remember this because that's part of what makes this betrayal so vile. So in 1688, King James is pushed out of England for being a little too Catholic and is replaced by the Protestant King William. James flees to France, where he hopes to find support to help him reclaim his throne. This leaves his supporters, known as Jacobites, unsure of what to do in the meantime. Many of the Scottish clans in the Highlands were loyal to King James, though not all of them, and this caused some division in the area. A Scotsman named John Dalrymple supported William during the Golden Revolution and is rewarded by being promoted to Secretary of State for Scotland, giving him authority over the land. Dalrymple does not like the Highlanders, and he knows the clans in the Highlands don't really like their new king, so he comes up with a plan to buy their loyalty. He offers the clans £12,000, a sum worth about $2.5 million today, to pledge their loyalty to their new king. This doesn't go as he planned, as the clans begin fighting over how the money should be split. The Campbells and the McDonalds of Glencoe in particular get into it, because they have a history of cattle theft against each other and think the other family shouldn't receive any of the money. Dalrymple decides that the bribe isn't really working out, so he instead issues an ultimatum in August. Pledge your loyalty to your new king to an official sheriff by January 1st of 1692, or you will be treated as traitors to the crown and face severe consequences. The clans don't really want to go against their sworn allegiance to King James, but James gets word and sends a message to the clans to swear the oath to William, as he can't mount an invasion in time. The clans receive this message from King James in December, and one by one, they begin pledging the oath. The McDonalds of Glencoe, however, for some reason don't get the message until December 28th. The chief of the McDonalds, McCain, has just 3 days to make the trek in the harsh Scottish winter to swear the oath. He makes it to a nearby fort on December 30th, hoping someone there could administer the oath, but the governor stationed there says he was not authorized to do so. The governor writes a letter explaining the situation and directs McCain to bring the letter to Sir Colin Campbell in Inverary. McCain does his best to get there in time but doesn't make the deadline. Campbell administers the oath on January 6, 1692, 7 days late. McCain returns home thinking that he and his clan are okay because, yeah, he was late, but he got the excuse note from that governor. Plus, other clans were late too, so he figured everything was good. But things were not all good. Dalrymple hears that the McDonalds were late with their oath and decides to make an example of them. He orders Captain Robert Campbell, of the Campbell clan the McDonalds had a long-standing cow theft feud with, to bring 120 soldiers to the McDonalds' home with orders for free quarter. Free quarter was the practice of offering soldiers food and shelter as a form of taxes, so McCain and the rest of the McDonalds didn't think much of it when these soldiers arrived at their doorstep. Even though Robert Campbell was from that annoying Campbell clan, his niece was married to one of McCain's sons, so they were like extended family. The McDonalds welcome in Campbell and his soldiers and treat them to exceptional Highlander hospitality. For 2 weeks, Campbell and his men are wined and dined and given the best sleeping accommodations the McDonalds had to offer. Everything seemed fine. Until the morning of February 13, 1692. McCain is awoken at 5 a.m. by his servant saying the soldiers were stirring. He tells his servant to bring the soldiers some drinks and begins to get dressed so he can send off his guests. As he's putting on his pants, one of Campbell's soldiers walks in and shoots him in the back. McCain dies on the spot. The soldiers then begin to storm each home, shooting men and women and children who are still sleeping in their beds. The commotion wakes up other members of the clan and they begin to run into the wild without food or clothing. The homes of the McDonalds are torched and many who fled on foot freeze to death in a howling blizzard. The official numbers say the soldiers killed 38 people, but the actual number may have been much higher, as those who fled most likely died of hypothermia and were never found.